Oh, so you're back for more, eh? Well, strap in, cause it's gonna get wild, because today we're going to be talking about a far-right cult that spreads anti-Semitic, racist, Islamophobic, homophobic, anti-trans, and other vile narratives that also happens to be one of the most prominent newspapers and right-wing political donors in the United States and the world, that, more than likely, is coming to a town very soon near you. Oh, and I don't mean that in an insidious, oh, some creepy far-right thought might start forming in a group near you. No, I mean quite literally, if you're like me, this group is potentially coming to a local theater and passing out flyers on your front door or in your local sushi restaurant. Yeah, it's kinda terrifying. But even more importantly, I want to talk to you about what this group has to say and why it's actually representative of a larger fascistic movement in the United States and worldwide. And I want to specifically hone in on the use of anti-trans narratives that we see in places around the United States and the world in things like the anti-trans legislation that has cropped up across numerous states in the United States in order to showcase how specific bigotries like the anti-trans movement are generated and then used to bring in people to larger fascistic worldviews. How anti-trans bigotry is not just an isolated pillar of hatred, but one that buttresses up much larger, vile narratives. But before we get started on that, here's a quick recap, because this video is actually a follow-up to my last video that was about a film called Gender Transformations. I highly recommend that you go and watch that video before you watch this one, but it's not strictly necessary to understand this one, because I'll give you a brief summary here. Gender Transformations is an anti-transgender docudrama created by the far-right newspaper The Epoch Times for its streaming service Epoch TV. Epoch Times advertised the film on numerous platforms, such as YouTube, directly targeting parents of transgender kids who may have had questions or even be worried about their child's gender identity, but not known much about trans people overall. Its secondary audience was also just parents in general, and specifically mothers. The film then manipulates this concern over the course of 2 hours into fear and anger against the transgender community, using typical anti-trans narratives and false information, such as right-wing funded detransitioners and manipulated studies, as well as a terrible fictional manipulative dramatization of a real-life transgender man's life and eventual suicide, with the aim to incite violence, both systemic and individual, personal and private, against trans people.
But at least my hope is to save other families, to go through what we went through.
The film ultimately makes a final argument for the continued transgender genocide we are currently seeing being enacted in the United States, United Kingdom, and elsewhere, with the furtherization of anti-transgender bills throughout numerous states and countries meant to destroy transgender healthcare and trans people's access to a public life living as ourselves, in hopes that we may go away, either go into the closet or die by suicide due to the mental strain. It also incidentally continually stokes the flame of individual bigotries against trans people. That also furthers the goal of pressuring trans people to stay out of public life. Most specifically, it does this through the manipulation of parents to explicitly pressure their child to be an excellent little perfect function for the capitalist machine, rather than it being their true selves as trans children. The film tells parents to pressure their children into being precisely who their parents want them to be, extensions of themselves and their 2.5 child family that our larger Western culture pushes for, instead of being their weird, strange, disgusting transgender kid.
You can understand my concern here, right, Mr.
I'm not happy as a girl.
Okay, well, let's talk to Mr. Scott and let's try to figure it out, all right?
Mom, why are you controlling me like this?
The film plays upon fundamentalist Christian narratives of a child's body being sacred, and that a parent knows the real them, and that a trans child is just a perversion, a changeling, a child stolen away from them by outside forces.
Honey, I love you.
You love the girl that you gave birth to.
God gave you this amazing body.
And it's this invokement of a blood libel-esque narrative that is the ultimate goal and focus of what I want to discuss today. Because as we saw in Gender Transformations, while the narrative was keenly focused on transgender kids, it also continually hinted at throughout the movie towards larger narratives.
Because you may have very large organizations, but there's a small group of people who are controlling these organizations, and they tend to be political.
Take, for example, TERF and anti-transgender writer Jennifer Bilek, hinting at in the film that pharmaceutical companies or woke Hollywood are manipulating trans kids for profit.
The powerful people behind this, the major corporations, major banks, international law firms, all our big technology companies, governments, politicians, at the highest echelons of Western societies. Why are they all doing this?
To parents of transgender children, affirming your child's identity is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep them safe and healthy.
Like, this is the most important question, really. Why are they all doing this simultaneously?
And then proceeds to name specific Jewish billionaires behind those groups.
And so what I found was a whole lot of very, very powerful, moneyed people in the highest echelons of finance, pharma, and technology.
Bilek, both in the film and in her work outside of it, argues that she's just asking questions, not saying it's Jewish people at all, but all while pointing her viewers and readers to more direct anti-Semitic voices, such as this neo-Nazi that she continually cites in her work. Beyond Bindel, we could also take the undercurrent that runs throughout gender transformations and a lot of anti-transgender rhetoric. I focus not on the personhood of transgender men who they're supposedly concerned about, but instead viewing these transgender men as young white girls tricked into the transgender agenda, who lose their reproductive ability and feminine body that appeals to a heterosexual male gaze.
It's destroyed my health. I don't know if I'll ever be able to conceive a child.
Up and down the country and around the world, girls are removing breasts that have never known a lover's caress.
It's as if their concern was less about protecting trans men and more about safeguarding their ability to breed. All of these hint towards larger connections to further far-right thoughts, and that's what I want to hone in on. And the reason is that transgender advocates, myself included by the way, often will talk about how anti-transgender narratives are found in proximity to right-wing groups, or even how fascistic movements like the Proud Boys or neo-Nazis will spout anti-transgender rhetoric to point to and say, look how anti-trans narratives are so close to fascism. But we rarely do the work to actually showcase how anti-transgender narratives are not just fascism adjacent, but a central pillar that, along with other pillars of bigotry, uphold a much larger fascistic worldview. Hey, so that was kind of a fun little intro. We had like lines going everywhere and stuff being circled, all very conspiracy theory-esque. Well, in that vein, today we're going to start off our discussion by talking about the Epoch Times, a right-wing news organization that has worked to incept far-right narratives into our culture. And part of the way that it attempts to do this is to try to not even allow those who come across its news articles on social media to be able to tell how biased those articles actually are. While I know many of you in my audience can spot a Matt Walsh type ranting about woke Hollywood media, the reason that culture war narratives like those being generated by outlets like the Epoch Times around trans people are so dangerous is because they get filtered into an increasingly partisan news media system that frames every issue in a binary way that devolves the conversation into a simple us versus them that ultimately centers around the most incendiary viewpoint. And that's where today's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. Ground News is a website and app on a mission to help readers understand the biases of different news outlets that you may encounter. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political biases, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, check out this story about college athletic organizations banning trans athletes. Right away, you can see that 142 news sources have reported on the story, and below that, you can see that 23% of the reporting comes from left-leaning organizations, while 24% comes from the right. You can even compare headlines to see how this bias affects framing. For example, a left-leaning source titles their article, "World Netball Bans Trans Athletes from International Competitions." In contrast, this right-leaning outlet says NAIA bans male athletes from women's sports to create fairness and competition. That's quite a big difference in how these articles frame trans women and the issue at hand in the title alone, and you're able to see these contrasting biases right there on Ground News. Ground News even has entire pages dedicated to specific news outlets. For the Epoch Times, you can see the breakdown of its political biases, its low factuality rating, and even that it's owned by Falun Gong, a group that we'll be talking more about in just a moment. Ground News is a fantastic tool for sifting through disinformation and bias. They provide all the tools that you need to be a critical thinker, and I cannot recommend it enough. In fact, I believe Ground News is so useful that I'm able to offer a 40% off their Vantage subscription, and you can only access this discount through my link, so go to the URL below or click the link in the video description and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. So thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video, but with that said, let's talk about what happens if you aren't given the technological or, more importantly, the educational tools to discern media bias like those shown by the Epoch Times. Gender Transformations was created and funded by the Epoch Times for its streaming service Epoch TV. The Epoch Times, if you haven't heard of it, is a far-right international news media company that operates in over 35 countries but is blocked by China. The reason for that is because Epoch Times was founded by John Tang and other Chinese Americans affiliated with the Falun Gong movement. Falun Gong is a cult that emerged in China in the 1990s, led by Li Hongzhi, who encouraged his followers to abandon lust, greed, and otherworldly attachments through meditation and dance. Which sounds absolutely great! However, Li also began to argue that Falun Gong could give his supporters superhuman powers, including levitating, which he claimed to be able to do. Just, not when people were looking. He also preached anti-evolution, anti-science, and anti-LGBTQ beliefs, arguing that science and queerness were manipulations by aliens who were trying to replace human beings with clones in order to stop humans from being able to reproduce with each other so that, ultimately, aliens could replace us. Told you we'd get there eventually.
The aliens started by teaching mankind about modern science, so people believe more and more science, and spiritually, they are controlled. Everyone thinks that scientists invent on their own when in fact their inspiration is manipulated by the alien. In terms of culture and spirit, they already control man. Mankind cannot live without science. The ultimate purpose is to replace humans. If cloning human beings succeeds, the aliens can officially replace humans. The aliens will take that opportunity to replace the human soul, and by doing so, they will enter Earth and become Earthlings. When such people grow up, they will help replace humans with aliens. They will produce more and more clones. There will no longer be humans reproduced by humans. They will act like humans, but they will introduce legislation to stop human reproduction.
Immediately, we can see how that dovetails very nicely with far-right conspiracy theory narratives about the anti-trans agenda and Jewish people controlling them, as we've been talking about. I mean, if you just replace the word aliens with Jews, it's the exact same thing. But first, let's take a look at some history. As we spoke about in the first video, there's also Magnus Hirschfeld, who founded the Institute of Sex Research in 1919 in Germany, which studied transgender people and homosexuality, mirroring Weimar Germany itself's institutional, if nominal, acceptance of transgender identities. Weimar German government even allowed some citizens to change gender markers on their government documents, similar to how some states allow people to do that in the US. Hirschfeld even coined the term transsexualism, which over the decades led to the word transgender. And it should be even clear that Hirschfeld was only studying people that he saw already existing in Weimar Germany around him. He did not generate the idea of being transgender, just provided some of the first study of transgender people in Western Europe. Much of his work was destroyed when the Nazis burned his clinic in the 1930s as they rose to power, arguing that the Jewish Magnus Hirschfeld was trying to corrupt Aryan bloodlines by turning fertile Aryans gay and transgender, one of the many anti-Semitic narratives used by the Nazis to uphold their authoritarianism and fascism that was justified through eugenic ideals of a superior race that could be bred through the Aryan bloodline, one that was, according to Nazi propaganda, being intentionally diluted by the inhuman Jews. Gender transformations and a lot of anti-trans rhetoric today is doing the same exact argument, pointing at the wealthy billionaires funding the trans agenda who just happen to be Jewish, and claiming that they're trying to ruin the reproductive health of your daughters so that they can destroy the Anglo-Saxon race, something that folks like Matt Walsh will blatantly talk about.
This is how the left has generally framed it. To be a less white country, by their telling, is to be a manifestly better country. That's why they celebrate the decline of the white population. It's why they actively seek to facilitate that decline in terms of percentages by inviting unchecked immigration across the southern border. It's why they're very concerned about making sure that white people have less institutional power.
Or you can take the Buffalo shooter who on May 14th, 2022 murdered 10 people and injured 3 more in Buffalo, New York. He traveled directly to a predominantly black neighborhood in order to kill black victims, and he often spoke about a Jewish order using black people to enact a white genocide as part of a great replacement. The whole idea of white replacement is directly based on fascistic rhetoric, and is dovetailing quite neatly with the narratives around anti-transness that we see throughout in films like Gender Transformations.
So there was already this idea going all the way back before the First World War that the only way that white people in the world could survive was if they found some way of containing and eventually controlling the growth of populations in non-white places.
In 1916, American lawyer and conservationist Madison Grant published one of the most influential books of the last 100 years, The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. Many of the ideas in Nazi Germany's racial science that rationalized the Holocaust were actually inspired by these American eugenicists. Hitler called Grant's book his Bible. And Hitler's Bible informed the foundation of environmentalism in this country itself. Grant argued that the so-called Nordic race was under threat from certain world populations, and that in order to protect the earth, its resources, and the environment, we needed to eliminate the migration and even the existence of certain populations. And central to Grant's solution was eugenics. Eugenics ascribes societal value to a person's race and class. Those who aren't seen as valuable are considered leeches on resources, and thus, under this outlook, they deserve to be lessened in numbers.
Further, the Buffalo shooter argued and pointed out how he believed trans people were primarily white and thought Jews were trying to make them infertile or kill themselves.
Yes, white goyim, give your children to me and I'll make them think they're girls. Thus, they'll all either kill themselves or become genetic dead ends. Oy vey, goyim. It's just too easy.
All of this is similar to blood libel stories that incite violence against Jewish people. Stories of Jewish people supposedly trying to steal children for rituals or replace them with inhuman monsters. Identical to the narratives of how trans-affirming doctors and trans advocates are trying to replace, steal, or make infertile your children, specifically your daughters, who we're only going to talk about in terms of their loss of reproductive health. And this is not isolated to violent shooters, but a lot of far-right rhetoric. Really, whenever you have a story of aliens replacing human beings in order to do nefarious things to us, you should be really fucking careful with that narrative, because it dovetails with actual bullshit. Anyways, getting back to the Epoch Times and Lee relocated to a rural hamlet and created a 400-acre compound north of New York City, a city with a sizable Jewish population, by the way, after the Chinese government began to persecute the cult within its country, leading eventually 10,000 people, including Falun Gong practitioners, to surround a CCP compound in Beijing, which eventually catalyzed the CCP to begin targeting Falun Gong members with further state violence, including supposed forced labor, internment, torture, and placing them in programs in order to harvest their organs for organ transplants against their will if they did die in captivity. However, the reports of all of this systemic violence is unclear and unspecific, mostly because the Falun Gong itself often exaggerates the numbers and specific targeting of the Falun Gong to elicit sympathy. Due to their persecution by the Chinese government, much of the Falun Gong's focus has been anti-China and anti-communist propaganda.
Before communism, China had a glorious past. What if you could bring it back?
The cult first became majorly known in the United States for the Shen Yun dance troupe that features a traveling show, which markets itself as a mix of traditional Chinese dance and Falun Gong practices, but features, if you end up attending the show, scenes of Gong members being tortured and a Karl Marx and Xi Jinping tsunami stopped by Li himself. Yep, Lee makes himself the messiah who quells a communist flood. Honestly, being frank with you, as much of this is all bullshit, nonsense, conspiracy theory stuff, I kinda would like to see a Karl Marx tsunami. I am here for the Karl Marx tsunami. But the Shen Yun performances were aimed at converting more people into the cult by enticing them with entertainment and making them appear more sympathetic, as well as targeting affluent communities to perform within in order to bring the cult more money. And the Shen Yun dance troupe travels across America. I even saw posters for their show playing in my local area when I went to my sushi shop just last week. And I even got flyers delivered to my door, which, to be frank, kind of freaked me out considering that I was working on this video at the time. What was even wilder though is that while I live on the West Coast, I traveled home to the East Coast for Christmas and saw posters for them there as well, showcasing how far-reaching the Shenyun dance troupe is. There are even billboards that you can see right now on the way into Los Angeles County. This is not just some small group, but one that has prominent reach across the United States, which is absolutely wild considering it is an actual cult spreading anti-Semitic, anti-trans, and more far-right beliefs. Just, having a billboard on the side of the highway. This eventually connects with the efforts of the Epoch Times, which, when it began in the early 2000s, also mainly featured anti-communist and anti-Chinese stories alongside its more standard news fare. The Epoch Times itself was funded by members of the Falun Gong and is often believed to be just a mouthpiece of the group. This, along with the cult's conspiracy theory beliefs that dovetailed with far-right beliefs, as we said before, led to it finding purchase within far-right and right-wing groups at the time. However, Epoch Times didn't gain much mainstream attention until Donald Trump rose to prominence in the 2016 election, as Falun Gong saw Trump's China hawkishness in his rhetoric as an opportunity for them, and they ended up spending more money on ads for Trump in the 2016 and 2020 elections than any other group outside of Trump himself. Yet, Epoch Times found its most significant influx of readers and money after it began to full-throated support Donald Trump's anti-Chinese rhetoric during the COVID-19 pandemic, building its brand off of COVID-19 conspiracy theories that underscored Falun Gong's anti-Chinese and anti-medicine viewpoint. They promoted the Chinese lab leak conspiracy theory without evidence and also echoed Trump's continual description of COVID-19 as the China virus. That was my best Trump. I try to be an entertainer for you. This is the best I can do. It's very good. I'm very good. No. It's not a thing I can do. The use of the term China virus helped to stoke anti-Chinese government sentiments and more directly led to hatred and violence against Chinese and Asian Americans within the United States.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no.
Epoch Times also saw huge numbers and spikes in its YouTube videos as it spread COVID-19 disinformation, funneling more and more viewers into its readership. Research found that by the end of 2020, Epoch Times pro-Trump content had helped to make it near ubiquitous in QAnon and other conspiracy theory groups, eventually leading it to find prominence and purchase in other countries outside of the US like Germany and Italy, all galvanized by those communities' anti-vaccine groups as well. From there, based on all the additional revenue they had, Epoch Times created their streaming service Epoch TV, which funds such wonderful films as Gender Transformations and works with directors like Tobias Elvich, who was the one asked by Epoch Times to create this film. Elvich had previously worked on propaganda pieces such as the series Divine Messengers and Red Lotus, A Forbidden Diary, a short film that propagandized a torture porn version of Falun Gong followers' mistreatment by the CCP. Further, Epoch Times regularly employs Falun Gong practitioners who, it was discovered, were barely paid for their work, receiving a salary of only $2,000 a year and the rest being paid in virtue, a supposed white substance in another dimension that you gain when you do good things. Okay. Yeah, pay me in virtue. I want that other dimensional white substance. Am I allowed to say that on YouTube? Now, the reason I share all this is not for me to just point at Epoch Times and say, oh, look at that kooky cult that funded this anti-trans film. Isn't that wild? I mean, I am doing that a little bit, but the real reason is that I'm pointing out what films like Gender Transformations are intentionally funneling their viewers towards and how we all, myself included, interact with these works. When people like myself try to take down anti-trans rhetoric, we tend to talk about it as if it exists in isolation from all other bigotries and systems. But in reality, they all ultimately collide and buttress each other up, bringing in people from different places but landing them all in the same ecosystem. Someone may come down a rabbit hole of COVID conspiracy videos on the Epoch Times or attend what they think is a culturally enriching Chinese dance show, but suddenly find themselves in a pipeline that will lead them to anti-trans beliefs, anti-Semitic propaganda, racist conspiracy theories, and more. These groups only view the people who work for them, transgender kids, detransitioners, parents, or even their employees or cult members as simple functions for their machine in order to generate them more revenue and attention, and ultimately, power. We can see this pipeline very clearly in that Epoch Times advertised this film alongside trans-supportive content like mine, trying to funnel concerned parents who are only worried about transgender issues into a darker web of conspiracy theories. When you click on their ads, the Epoch Times even gives you 10 minutes of the film for free to watch. And once you've watched that 10 minutes, well, it hopes that it's hooked you deeper and deeper in, and eventually you'll pay for Epoch TV to watch this film, and then suddenly you're on the site where you're continually fed a diet of further conspiracy-filled content, not just anti-trans propaganda. The Epoch Times and Shen Yun are best understood as spiritual propositions that promise to save your soul if you buy into their product. A similar proposition that things like the Daily Wire or right-wing conspiracy theories will also do, though in less spiritual, explicit terms. By the way, a quick reminder for those of you who watched the last video, as well as those of you who are new to this video, what you're about to hear in just a moment, and a couple other times throughout the video, is a quote from a teacher who works with some transgender kids in a more left-of-center leaning school district here in the United States who I interviewed for this video, but who I'm anonymizing on their request to protect their identity and job.
When the pandemic happened, everybody was rightfully worried and scared. We didn't know what was happening and had to rely on the internet to find new recommendations and updates. It was easy to go from a legitimate source of info to a more shady one, and then to total misinformation and conspiracy theories. Once you click on these videos, you keep being recommended more. I think many people everywhere were looking for a reason, a why, and from there, for someone to blame, for a scapegoat. Fearmongers on YouTube were propagating health misinformation and racist theories. From there, it's the rabbit hole. I think it was just a gateway to scare people more and more. Parents are always concerned for their kids. It's normal. They also want to be involved in their education, and sometimes they also worry when their kids are learning concepts that they are unfamiliar with. Most families in liberal spaces welcome diverse conversations and want their children to learn about the world around them. However, there's been more and more of a new type of interaction where people, maybe 0.5% of the parent population, but oh, they are loud, just skip questions and worries and go directly to accusations and threats.
In fact, let's talk a little bit more about that target audience of concerned parents, because we need to discuss how the film is not just aimed directly at them, but more specifically middle-class, affluent white parents and their perspectives. At one point in the film, Evan is called a Karen by a bully in the class.
Yeah, don't be so disrespectful. We're trying to learn here.
Okay, Karen.
Hey.
For Evan to be insulted as a Karen underscores the rude perspective of the film. This is not the way that kids actually insult each other. As someone who was called many, many things in my youth, and still to this day, I can tell you that kids are much more creative than that. While the drama is narratively about a young trans man's journey, the fears the story is centered upon are not ones that he would actually face, but instead his mother's and vicariously the parents the film is catered towards centering. Ultimately, Evan and all the kids present in this film, real or fictional, become objects for the film's intended audience of concerned upper-class white mothers to project their fears and agency upon. So much so that even the lower middle-class trans child of ambiguous racial background that the fictional narrative supposedly centers upon is attacked with insults wielded often against middle-aged upper to middle-class white women, like the term Karen. Thus, the film is used to instigate this fight while simultaneously ignoring racial aspects of words like Karen. Karen is a pejorative term that originated within the black community to describe a white woman asserting her power as an upper-class white woman to get what she wants in a situation, often wielding her ability to be viewed as a victim, typically through explicit or subconscious white woman tears, playing off of the ingrained assumption in our society that BIPOC folks, especially black men, are seen as inherently violent and dangerous, in order to get others to wield institutional power and violence against them. Think of the famous Central Park dog-walking Karen, who called the cops crying, claiming to be in danger from a black photographer and Star Trek comic book writer Christian Cooper, who was simply birdwatching in the park. The word Karen describes women who actively wield their whiteness and white femininity through perceived victimhood to weaponize existing hierarchical systemic power structures over racialized groups and people. While the term has partially been co-opted and diluted by mainstream dominant culture, as many things created by the black community often are, to just mean white women complaining and often used by white men to enforce patriarchal control over white women, its primary usage is still rooted in identifying invisible systems of white supremacy and how it interacts with white womanhood to uphold itself. As a result, Karen has been framed as a sexist, classist, ageist slur by not only upper-class conservative women, but increasingly by gender-critical anti-trans women, such as Julie Bindel, as well, which underscores the connection and anxieties surrounding the use of the term and often upper-class white womanhood framing of the gender-critical movement against transgender people, and their often inability to recognize that while they, as women, face sexism, they are also privileged in numerous other aspects through being white and having economic means. Instead, these gender-critical feminists will frame their experience of womanhood, one often intersecting with multiple economic and social privileges, as the only valid experience of womanhood and not understanding how that womanhood upholds a patriarchal system when wielded against Black, Indigenous, people of color. So here too we come to an essential understanding of how anti-trans narratives like this thrive. It's the same reason that gender-critical folks will also call cis a slur, white feminism a slur, TERF a slur, despite many of those words being often used to just describe a power hierarchical dynamic that they don't wish to fit into or even recognize, because it would reveal how they are upholding those very systems. While words like cis are just used to recognize that there are trans and cis people trying to normalize the idea of being trans instead of seeing cis as normal, words like white feminism and TERF are intentionally derogatory because yes, it is a bad thing to be a white feminist or a TERF because you're upholding a power hierarchical dynamic that you're trying to make invisible that ultimately harms transgender people, as well as many marginalized groups. And by the way, I'd recommend this excellent video by the leftist cooks or the book Elite Capture, which will go into greater detail about how understandings of intersections of identity have been segmented and cast against each other. About how we see things like racism or anti-Semitism or anti-transness as separate things that we need to fight instead of interlocking systems that all work together to ultimately fuel the same system of power.
Especially in recent history, more often than not, one form of oppression has been replaced with another, different form that is similar or even more unjust than the one that preceded it. But maybe we want more than to play whack-a-mole with injustice. If we want to do more than alter the color of our children's chains, we will have to successfully oppose more than isolated instances of oppression.
To understand where this white feminist attitude in gender-critical quote-unquote feminism comes from and how it gets weaponized by movements seeking to uphold a hierarchical status quo in our society, we need to briefly explore the root of how feminism was conceptualized within the United States. Black men were continually framed as a danger to white women's purity and virginhood, as we see in films like Birth of a Nation, building off of the slavery-justifying narratives that had existed since colonialization began, as we discussed earlier in this video. And this framing of blackness, a concept literally created by colonialization to frame blackness against white people, i.e. European folks, as a threat to white women, caused white suffragettes to start fighting for the rights of white women to vote over the voting rights of Black, Indigenous, and Asian women, seeing them as not only distinctive fights, but ones that were directly opposing each other. Many of the early white suffragettes fighting for women's rights and women's right to vote specifically often framed women's rights in direct contention with Black folks' right to vote, with Anna Howard Shaw, the National Women's Suffragette Association president, stating after the ratification of the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote,
"You have put the ballot in the hands of your Black men, thus making them political superiors of white women. Never before in the history of the world have men made former slaves the political masters of their former mistresses."
Many white supremacists realized that this framing of white women versus Black people worked in their favor, even helping to fund the white suffragette movement. George Francis Train, a white supremacist at the time who supported a return to slavery, founded the women's rights newspaper Revolution in order to further instigate this dichotomy to uphold white supremacy. This laid the groundwork for much of how we think about feminism today in the US, going well into modern American feminist movements. Take Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which is a foundational text for second-wave feminism, establishing the idea of a white woman as the woman and subject of feminism, as writer Rafi Zarkiri points out in her book Against White Feminism.
In comparing woman to others, who include blacks and Jews, de Beauvoir reveals herself to be thinking of woman as only white women. From the very introductory pages of The Second Sex, de Beauvoir identifies otherness as the fundamental category and woman as the ultimate other, in a way similar to how the natives of a country see inhabitants of other countries as foreigners, Jews as the others for anti-Semites, blacks as racist Americans, indigenous peoples for colonists, proletarians for the propertied classes. things. In de Beauvoir's view, then, the justifications for inferior contradictions of race, class, and caste are not just comparable, but rather the same. In this way, she sheets each of these as discrete systems of oppression that could be compared, but did not overlap. In every comparison that de Beauvoir makes between women and blacks, however, the blacks are assumed to be American and male, and the women are assumed to be white.
This willful blindness on the part of many prominent white feminists is intentionally incentivized by the system, playing upon upper middle class to upper class white women's understanding of how they exist within a generated hierarchical dichotomy of men versus women, essentially understanding that they live in a patriarchal society that oppresses them, yet insulates them from understanding that there is an underclass that is generated through intersecting economic, racial, religious, as well as gender and other generative hierarchies that themselves were framed against white womanhood. As a result, it allows many white feminists to play into a binary fight of them against the patriarchy while simultaneously pushing down others who speak on the necessity of intersectionality required to accurately deconstruct the systems of white supremacy that those very standards of white womanhood were built upon.
Eugenicist ideas didn't start or end with the conservationists. They proliferated across movements led by white Christian Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. From birth control to temperance, both feminist movements, which advocated better breeding to lessen the strain on resources, on poor families, and to help develop better children who would become better citizens. Margaret Sanger, the founder of the American Birth Control League, the precursor to Planned Parenthood, was a believer in eugenics, and her activism on birth control centered on, quote, weeding out the unfit and preventing the birth of defectives. And these ideas, especially as outlined by Madison Grant, had an impact on American governance and the shaping of the future of this country. Theodore Roosevelt's progressive presidency was influenced greatly by Grant's ideas about conservation and the decline of the Nordic race, which Roosevelt blamed on white mothers having fewer babies, threatening a so-called race suicide. Grant's book also informed one of the first most expansive immigration bills in this country's history, the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which included the National Origins Act and the Asian Exclusion Act. It was signed into federal law by President Calvin Coolidge.
In the period of the late 19th, early 20th century, the main way in which people in relatively rich and powerful countries wanted to regulate the population of the world was by making it harder for poorer people to migrate and move around the world. By the 1920s and 30s, increasingly they were trying to shape the way in which people chose to have children, and in some cases actually prevent people from having children. And so this was a period of the 20s and 30s especially where you saw this idea of eugenics, where it wasn't just about the numbers. You had to manipulate not just the quantity of people, but also the quality, right? And so that meant, especially targeting people that were deemed to be unfit.
Take, for example, how Helen Joyce, a noted anti-trans campaigner, will say she's fighting the patriarchy, which she frames as trans women, and then argues for the way to do that is for more policing of marginalized groups like trans people, arguing for the use of state violence and power against a marginalized community.
Last weekend in Manchester, I was followed down the road by about 100 men, some of them with loudhailers, shouting the usual idiotic slogans with a couple of additions, fuck Helen Joyce, my body, my choice, and there are many, many more of us than you. It would make some sense to call that hateful, but to be clear, I don't think we need a new law to deal with it. We just need better policing, and we already have public order offences.
In reality, she's using her place of privileged white womanhood in order to argue for the continualization of the status quo that oppresses minority groups like trans people and Black, Indigenous people of color.
When TERFs are accusing trans people of weaponizing our marginalization, what they're speaking to is the kind of on-the-fence cis audience where they're like, oh yeah, because when they say these things, I do feel bad. So yeah, that is weaponization. The reason that they feel bad is because we are challenging their beliefs. That's why it's threatening. It's intellectually threatening. And that's fair. That's a scary feeling. That is a very scary feeling. But again, if there was like one thing that I could really, really instill in people, it is to look for that. Are they trying to question a hierarchy, or are they trying to reinforce a hierarchy? Because depending on which of those two things is going on, you kind of know who the good guys are.
Yeah, and I think why it gets difficult for so many people to recognize that cognitive dissonance is all of these things that we are fighting against: patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, even colonialism, like all these things have worked to make themselves feel like they are natural and normal and an intrinsic part of our identity. They are just like how the way the world is. Like women are inherently weaker, and that those ideas just like coming from like, the bullshit, colonization narratives against Black people framing white women as weaker, women as property, coming from like, capitalism in the economic system that, came before it as well. It's like those things have been instilled as normal, like women are inherently weaker. And so when like you're discussing the ways women can be and not framed in that hierarchical assumption, people sort of go like, well, that's what I've identified so heavily with. I identified with like having to fight from like seeing my womanhood as like something as a place of strength. Like they don't recognize that we're like trying to break down that bullshit that women are inherently some weaker in some way. And because of that, because they have so identified with that sense of like, oh, this is where I need to fight from, that sense of like being placed in that hierarchy, that's when they have the cognitive dissonance. And they don't really recognize it as breaking down a hierarchy because they have so internalized it as part of their identity that all this whole system functions upon.
Oh, yes. The TERFs accuse us of invalidating their fight because of the steps we are taking to create a world where they don't have to fight in the first place.
Yes.
It's just, it's like...
Yeah.
Oh, that's so frustrating.
Well, it goes to speak to it. It's like the constant need for the us versus them. It's like they have so identified with being the them in the patriarchal us versus them that to lose that makes them feel scared because it's a hard place to be in, but it is the only place that they know, and it feels comfortable to be there in the sense that like they recognize it, and to do something new would be scary. Like we're talking about in terms of TERFs, but that's the thing that buttresses up so much of stuff. Like all of the like anger towards marginalized people, the fascists do it openly and willingly and knowingly.
Yeah.
But the often more insidious one is the problem of like trying to get people to recognize that like we are going to have like to fight this, things are going to have to change, and that is scary, and it's going to mean a reframing of how you place yourself in identity with the world. And that will often maybe mean that this weird axis of privilege and yet marginalization that you sit within will go away, which means you will lose the privilege, but it also hopefully mean that we can create a more egalitarian society. That's very scary.
Yes.
All this goes to say that if your feminism is not also fighting white supremacy, it's not actually fighting for women. Kayleigh Conrad, who I spoke to in my first video, is a YouTuber and investigative journalist who signed up as a member of several online anti-transgender parental groups to study them for their video series that I highly recommend about these groups and their mindsets.
Any feminist in the group who was a woman of color who would bring up the fact the ideology rampant in the groups was like very like surface level white feminism. They would get flamed. I've never seen so many women turn out to have a conversation in these groups than when another gender critical woman who is a woman of color is critical of the way they discuss things. Like a few weeks ago, a gender critical woman who was Indian commented and said, like, can we stop talking about how these trans women have hairy arms? Because like the hair on my arms is dark too, and like that doesn't make me a man. And like so many of the comments were like, shut up, like this isn't about you, and like why are you calling our feminism white feminism? You're trying to divide the movement. It's very
shut up person of color, shut up.
Yes.
Yeah. And so in
real feminists are talking.
This centering of white womanhood, which many just frame as the only way a woman can exist, and its battle against patriarchy is something you'll often see conflated in gender-critical narratives, with their anti-trans narratives arguing that young girls, aka trans men, are just trying to escape the pressures of womanhood placed on them by a patriarchal society by pretending that they are trans. We even see this idea dramatized in Evan's story when he expresses seeing his brother having an easier life.
I look at my brother and everything seems so easy for him. And I just feel confused.
This falls into a common anti-trans anxiety and narrative that trans men are just women who know that sexism in our society exists and just end up hating themselves, hating being women. For example, this anxiety was expressed by J.K. Rowling in her anti-trans manifesto.
The writings of young trans men reveal a group of notably sensitive and clever people. The more of their accounts of gender dysphoria I've read, with their insightful descriptions of anxiety, dissociation, eating disorders, self-harm, and self-hatred, the more I've wondered whether, if I had been born 30 years later, I too might have tried to transition. The allure of escaping womanhood would have been huge. I struggled with severe OCD as a teenager. If I'd found community and sympathy online that I couldn't find in my immediate environment, I believe I could have been persuaded to turn myself into the son my father had openly said he'd have preferred.
TERFs who are people who get pulled into that thinking, especially people who experience multiple marginalizations, they're sort of existing in that same space that I was existing in and that many trans men exist in before we transition, where we're like, I can't betray womanhood. I can't betray this movement. I can't betray all this work that I've done. It's obviously very different, and they've been misled in how they are applying that drive. Mm-hmm. But like, I see this sense of loyalty that they have, and I genuinely feel for them. And not even in that way of like, I feel for them, but they're wrong. It's like, I feel for them, and I really hope we can reach a place where they feel understood in that, and they feel empowered with us to take apart that system that has them trapped there to begin with.
Yeah.
Like, that'd be everything. That would be perfect.
Unfortunately, like the way the documentary works, and this is kind of where kind of lead us to an end, is like it takes that energy and places it into this pipeline that then goes like, let's name all these Jewish people that are controlling the trans agenda, or conspiracy theories, and more all things that uphold the fascist narrative, right? However, many anti-trans activists who claim to be feminists have to actively work to deny or ignore that their words are used to target marginalized groups through the upholding of fascistic narratives. And that has been made no clearer than a recent incident with J.K. Rowling, a woman who has continued to fall further and further down this radicalization pipeline that I've been talking about, that she fell into several years ago when she began investigating concerns around transgender people. That incident being that she recently engaged in Nazi crime denialism. My fellow YouTubers Kaylee and Conrad, Council of Geeks, and Brigitte Empire have all made videos going into further detail on this specific topic that I'll link below, but to briefly summarize here, J.K. Rowling recently tweeted a denial that Nazis burnt books on transgender healthcare and research, and continued to double down on that statement when people called her out on this being Nazi crime denialism, specifically denying that the Nazis burned the aforementioned Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology, one of the first and most known public book burnings done by the Nazi Party. And Rowling is not alone in this denialism through her gender-critical beliefs, as we can see, for example, with 32-year-old biology graduate student Mary Louise Vollbrecht in Berlin, who went to court in Germany after she denied Nazi war crimes by claiming that to describe transgender people as victims of the Nazi state, quote, mocks the true victims of the Nazi crimes. J.K. Rowling, Vollbrecht, and numerous other gender-critical anti-trans activists argue that trans people were never targeted by the Nazis, which is abjectly untrue, as we have numerous sources that cite that transgender individuals, sometimes known as transvestites at that time, were specifically targeted by the Nazis. As Kaylee and Conrad cited in their video, in the expert testimony against Vollbrecht, it was stated, quote,
"The first scholarly publications on transgender people under National Socialism argue that they were not persecuted. To be more specific, one foundational essay argued that they were not persecuted, and another argued that some trans women were, but only insofar as officials mistakenly believed them to be cisgender gay men. This, however, is not accurate. Newer research shows a more complex and violent situation. The newer scholarship also makes the case that racial status and other factors mattered when trans people ran into trouble with the Nazi state. Trans people were at risk. The risks they ran varied according to other things in their lives. Not all trans people suffered violence, yet there is a pattern of state hostility and police harassment of trans people, particularly trans women. In some cases, it ended in murder."
I'll link more sources on this below, but as mentioned in that court case, race played a specific role in how trans people were targeted by the Nazis. For example, while some trans people that were considered to be Aryan by the Nazis were sent to brutal conversion therapy institutions in order to try to preserve their Aryan bloodlines, racialized transgender people, like Jewish trans folks, were sent to concentration camps and given a pink triangle to mark them alongside their fellow queer members at the camps. Further, Aryan, quote-unquote, trans people who did not submit to convert under conversion therapy were also eventually either sent to the conversion therapy camps or just outright murdered. I do plan on doing a larger video on this specific topic in the future, but for now, I'll again direct you to these 3 videos for more information on that. But for our purposes in this video, it's important just to note that anti-trans activists like Rowling must deny these crimes in order to square their belief that they are acting in the benefit of women and feminism, rather than what they're actually doing, acting in service of an oppressive status quo built on racialization and class divides that only buttress up their specific version of upper-class womanhood as legitimate in order to defend the patriarchal status quo. For them either to publicly or even cognitively recognize the Nazi crimes against transgender people would mean that they have to recognize the lie at the foundation of their belief system, and thus tear apart their ability to dogmatically exist within their racialized fascistic worldview that formed and centralized around their fears and bigotries towards transgender people. Since we've been touching upon it a lot, we now need to discuss how race is brought up, or more importantly, not brought up, within gender transformations and larger anti-trans narratives. One interesting thing to note is that gender transformations is centered not around a white child that most detransitioner narratives center themselves upon, but the story of a real-life Latino child played by a racially ambiguous family in the dramatized sections, demonstrating how the film is attempting to give the aesthetic of diversity, the veneer that it is showcasing a holistic experience of American life, without actually speaking to the material realities that Abigail Martinez, a single Hispanic mother, and Andrew Martinez, a Hispanic trans man, would face.
But I almost wonder if they were paying attention enough to notice that critics of these hierarchical systems talk a lot about race, and we're like, okay, well, let's feature people who aren't white in this documentary and show them that, like, I almost wonder if that was part of it.
Utilizing a Latino story in order to sort of obfuscate that this is upholding a white supremacist worldview of like, we will accommodate the story because it sort of fits our narrative. And we can appropriate this group in order to give the veneer that we are being more inclusive.
That's the thing. It's like a subtle hand trick, right? It's a wink and a nod because it shows you the Hispanic person. It doesn't necessarily try to hide the fact that this is a Latin family, but it's also completely avoiding like any kind of discussion of that. And one might think that there's some ways that right-wingers will address issues of racism, but usually it comes down to these sort of stereotypical individualized ideas of like, oh, this person went to the grocery store and got called a mean name. That's about as far as they'll acknowledge anything, because it's trying to centralize the idea it's an individual issue. Certain people are just bad people and they're immoral, and because of them, that this issue exists, and if we could just, do something to the bad people, they'll go away, rather than an idea that a person's entire situation is made up of a ton of different decisions that are completely out of their control, that shape how even the way that they look affects how they live, how they're treated, what they get to have. And this is a pretty straightforward, I think, part of, let's say, right-wing messaging, which is the propagation of a narrative that suggests a neutrality of a human experience. It's based in nature, which like this comes back to transphobia. And usually the suggestion for one is one of like, if you speak about what differences are with culture and race that may especially lead to segregations and, material issues, then that's what makes you the outsider, because you're questioning the norm. We're talking about capital also. So what we're talking about is pushing a narrative that there is a norm, and that if you simply follow the norm, you'll be okay. Yeah. And the people who are the problem are the people who at all question the norm, or who at all work towards changing the norm. And so it's very easy to proposition the character of a therapist, even discussing gender, as being equivalent to a manipulator who is subtly using words and nods to indicate to a person that they are actually not who they actually are. It's this way of saying that there is a path, and we are, a good person follows the straight and narrow path to, success in society. And then there are all these distractions, and there are all these sort of caricaturistic villains along the way that are going to try to pull you off of that and make you think about gender and race and what about if things are not fair. And those people are sort of the people we have to watch out for.
All of this showcases how the Western right wing is happy to utilize radicalized, marginalized voices to further its propaganda, but not actually acknowledge the aspects that those people face in a country that often racializes so many, because to do so, to point that out, would underscore the lie at the heart of the system that these narratives wish to uphold. It would reveal why Andrew Martinez perhaps faced more challenges as a Latino trans man than a white trans man, having less access to trans-affirming care in his areas, or just generally having less money to be able to afford them, as well as potentially facing overt racism. Ultimately, to talk about race in any way beyond individualized resentments or anger or individual racists is dangerous for those who try to wield systemic power, because it would mean acknowledging the United States racist underpinnings that uphold its entire system. So instead, everything must be framed as neutral or individual. The idea of a neutrality of experience under the hegemonic system underpins a fascistic ideal. It frames marginalized communities and the struggles of folks who sit higher in a hierarchy as similar structures. This is not just in racialized context. We see it in gender issues and how these gendered identities are pitted against each other. You hear this very idea when anti-trans narratives get platformed on TV shows and news media on the basis that we just need to hear the other side.
I wanted to have a rational, sensible debate. They didn't. So that's it. They won't be back.
The only reason that they're framed as a side is because they frame themselves as women versus trans people, when in reality, it's not women versus trans people, it's bigots who wish to uphold the system versus trying to push back against trans autonomy. To fight for actual womanhood would require you fighting for trans rights as well, because we are not separate fights. It's why you'll often see the same groups that attempt to justify anti-abortion narratives against cisgender women also fight transgender autonomy as well.
You might be thinking to yourself, why is a lesbian speaking at the Heritage Foundation? And I ask myself the same thing.
But this idea that we just need to hear the other side leading to the platform of hateful rhetoric is precisely what happened with gender transformations, by the way. The film was screened at the Manhattan Film Festival despite calls for its removal for its hateful content. Yet the Manhattan Film Festival let it air because they, quote, wanted to show both sides. Here's an interview with gender transformations director saying just as much.
So at the Manhattan Film Festival, actually they received a lot of messages that they wanted them to, you know, they asked them, like, how can you show something so transphobic at the festival and things like that. They were answering in a very good way. They were just like, well, we really want to stand up for everyone's point of view, and we don't like to censor things, and they also said that in the beginning, before they showed the film, they were kind of, you know, I almost felt like they were proud that they were, let's stand up together against, you know, censorship.
This is why the concept of neutrality on issues of marginalized identities, viewing discrimination as solely an individual issue rather than reflecting intersecting hierarchical structures under an oppressive system, is ultimately used to propagate the hierarchies further. Speaking of discussing intersections of identities and how they are differently racialized or oppressed, we should discuss why this film is about a Latino family and not a Black or Indigenous family, for example.
Yeah, one of the central parts of that is that these groups are entirely descended from immigrant groups, which have immigrated to the U.S. Either in the past, 50 years, past century, even a little bit farther than that. And what immigration entails ideologically is pretty much, not 100% of the time, but often a sense of, we are going to this country because it will be better for us. To the US to have a better life, things are better here, things are safer here. There's very much a material, you can say, issue in the balance of survival and of thriving somewhere. And when you put that kind of pressure on a person, then it also sort of motivates them to not only make this decision to move, but also to fully buy into this move as something that will be, revolutionary for their life, something that will change sort of their conditions of living in such a dramatic way so as to get rid of the issues they were facing before, that won't follow them into the United States, and also to power them through all these stages so that they can eventually reach that American dream, that success story, right? It's like this idea of whether you doubt something or you don't doubt something. If you have doubt on your way to accomplishing a task, it often holds you back. But if you have no doubt in your head, then you can make it. And so the immigrant family is conditioned by American propaganda to believe, if you just put your head down, you work hard, you don't question anything, you're going to move up the ladder and you're going to have the American dream, and your family will have all that it needs and more, and you won't have to deal with any of the negative and the darkness and the evil that was from your past. This is sort of what fuels a lot of the right-wing political affiliations of a lot of immigrant families from Latin America and Asian America in the United States. It's accepting sort of the Latin family as being a part of the American fabric, so long as the Latin family simply doesn't question anything and is trying to be good and honest.
Yeah.
And then here you have this child who is going through this crisis, who is transitioning, and you can easily say, well, this family was torn apart by somebody who took the American dream away from them.
Further, this goes to another discussion that the film leaves out: how Black and Indigenous trans women are often the most vilified and at risk for violence in the United States.
It's not lost on me at all that Black trans men and Indigenous trans men especially get very little, if any, visibility. Very, very little. And as we've seen, they're willing to dabble in like Latino trans man representation or, like Asian trans man representation. And that's not me saying that like the racism that those two groups of people face isn't also a massive problem. But it's very interesting to me and very telling that two groups of people who are very, 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 very much directly harmed systemically by white supremacy and colonialism and the ongoing forces at play within, that they're not willing to look at them. They're not willing to prop them up. They're not willing to even acknowledge that those people exist.
Black Americans, right? You have people who descend from generations of slavery in the United States who have developed, for one, a very strong intellectual tradition that is very much that they're acculturated into from a young age, that has a sort of separate, like I guess you could say counter-hegemonic almost approach to the world in a sense. Even though many people are not radicalized despite being Black, despite being of Indigenous ancestry, there is such history with them in the United States of them being oppressed, being marginalized, being killed. And from those histories, such, visible, undeniable movements, outspoken about that. Obviously, the civil rights movement stands out. That their sort of cultural approach to something even like the American dream has to be essentially put in a different film.
Gender Transformations aesthetically likes to showcase a visual appearance of diversity, but does not talk about how being trans intersects with how America has so racialized specific identities in specific ways. And all of this goes to show how the United States ultimately wields racial identities against each other. Take the Epoch Times itself. While there have been investigations into Epoch Times and Falun Gong's funding, it has never been entirely clear. However, there are connections to right-wing funders like Breitbart benefactor Robert Mercer.
While the Epoch Times is not required to list its donors, it reported $8.4 million in revenue from contributions and grants in 2020 and 2021. Tax documents from that period filed by scores of donors, accessed through ProPublica's nonprofit Explorer, show some of those funds came from conservative donors and foundations. In 2021, the Epoch Times received $55,750 from the National Christian Charitable Foundation, which connects anonymous donors with Christian causes, and $31,000 from Donors Trust, a fund for conservative and libertarian donors. Smaller donations came from individuals, real estate agents, investors, and surgeons among them, and small family foundations, most of which support right-wing causes including evangelical Christian groups, anti-vaccine groups, and far-right media organizations.
Epoch Times is a far-right Chinese-American organization wielded by the far-right to spread disinformation about communism and hatred towards China through COVID conspiracy theories. You can also see how right-wing groups argue that affirmative action hurt Asian Americans in the US Supreme Court in 2023, ultimately leading to the dismantling of affirmative action in United States universities, underscoring how the right wing is quite capable of using one's racialized identity to try to remove systems that are made to benefit other racialized identities, pitting these two communities against each other.
Affirmative action, with the power of the federal government behind it, was able to encourage institutions to begin to show from year to year that they are enrolling African American students in particular.
This created unprecedented education and employment opportunities for marginalized ethnic communities. And
made a huge difference, especially for the most selective institutions.
But some Asian American students don't see it that way.
Even the fact that when an Asian American student is applying to these universities and there's a slight doubt in their head that maybe my race might be used against me, maybe I didn't work hard enough, just even that thought being there is dangerous. One of my classmates got Harvard and another got Princeton. I got rejections from all of them, so I was like, where is my acceptances? My name is Michael Wang. I personally filed a complaint against 3 of the top universities in the US about affirmative action.
And when you eliminate race-conscious admissions, we may also be eliminating strongest aspects of an application from an Asian American applicant, especially from an immigrant population.
Here in Gender Transformations, we can see how Latino and Asian Americans are often wielded against Black and Indigenous Americans in a culture war narratives for the right wing to give the appearance of progressiveness, attempting to erode solidarity between communities that actually have a common struggle. And the same can also be seen in anti-trans discussions when trans issues are framed as against women's issues, despite trans and women's issues being intersecting due to both being identities marginalized by neoliberalist and fascist practices.
When it comes to words like transphobia, it's simply used to silence women, like myself, who are trying to protect women's spaces, language, and rights.
This wielding and justifying working with racialized communities to prop up a hegemonic structure, despite being antithetical to the stated hierarchical ideology, has historical precedent within fascistic and far-right narratives. While fascism likes to frame itself as a party of ideology and, more importantly, ethnic purity, it is often willing to grant informal honorary equal status to those whom their express rhetoric would overtly vilify or dehumanize. Hitler, for example, declared the Japanese people Honorary Aryans during World War II in order to justify working with what would typically have been seen in Nazi ideology as a lesser race, as Hitler needed to create an alliance with Japan. All of this is then bolted on to a fascistic viewpoint later on. Hitler, for example, began to argue that he did not view the Japanese people as equals, but stated in Mein Kampf,
"The foundations of actual life in Japan today are not those of the native Japanese culture, although this characterizes the external features of the country, which features strike the eye of European observers on account of their fundamental difference from us. But the real foundations of contemporary Japanese life are the enormous scientific and technical achievements of Europe and America, that is to say, of Aryan peoples. Only by adopting these achievements as the foundations of their own progress can the various nations of the Orient take a place in contemporary world progress. The scientific and technical achievements of Europe and America provide the basis on which the struggle for daily livelihood is carried on in the Orient. If, from today onwards, the Aryan influence on Japan would cease, and if we suppose that Europe and America would collapse, then the present progress of Japan in science and technique might still last for a short duration. But within a few decades, the inspiration would dry up, and native Japanese character would triumph, while the present civilization would become fossilized and fall back into the sleep from which it was aroused about 70 years ago by the impact of Aryan culture."
His argument was that the Japanese people could only grow to be a superpower worthy of his allyship because Aryans had influenced them. All of this showcases how fascism is not a consistent ideology, but just one used to justify decisions that benefit the powerful after the fact. Hitler and the Nazis needed to ally with Japan and Middle Eastern countries, and so did so, then justified doing that through whatever means necessary that fit their ideology. We can see similar parallels to how Asian and Hispanic people are used today by right-wing groups, exemplified by works like Gender Transformations, that these rhetorics are willing to use the aesthetic of non-American or Western European cultures to increase their appeal and allyship, but not willing to engage in viewing said cultures as equal. It's all lies made after the fact used to justify decisions to protect one's power.
People are constantly seeing new things. We're constantly seeing new truths as human beings, because we're constantly feeling alienated and isolated. It's only natural when you live like this. And so every time one of these new things pops up, capital scrambles to do something about it. It will subvert it, it will subvert elements of it into being actually, a part of the hegemony, like what it'll do with music genres, what it'll do with certain trans figures, what it'll do with certain figures from different ethnic backgrounds. And then it'll simultaneously launch these more violent offenses backed by, ideological convenience to say, well, these are the parts that just had to get stomped out. This is what I think has brought these, critical race, critical gender theory debates, wokeism, like all that. It's just some whatever worked in the time. It's like when you had to lie to your mom and you had to come up with like, oh well, actually I was in chess class, right? You just whatever worked that year. It's not about lying. Is not about consistent ideological logic. It is about getting away with something, and so it's just present.
The way to think about gender ideology is that it is a sibling of critical race theory. Critical race theory goes into schools to convince white kids that they bear the original sin of their skin color. Critical race theory postulates that race is the most important feature of any person, and that white people, existing as they do in a state of racial privilege, are not able to participate in a wide variety of discussions about our democracy. Gender ideology tells women, which it calls cis women, that they are not entitled to their fear or their sense of unfairness as biological men invade their protective spaces and claim their trophies and records and scholarships.
All of this then is by no means surprising that this then crosses paths with ableism that we see within anti-trans spaces, going back to the autism discussions from earlier, with fascist groups often arguing for the sterilization of those deemed feeble-minded. Lest I end up just continually using the Nazis in order to discuss fascism, we can also talk about how America used these same arguments of eugenics to create forced sterilization bills in Indiana, Washington, California, and Connecticut in the early 20th century. Further, social mobility was indicated by one's quote-unquote genetic fitness in the United States, built upon reaffirming class and racial hierarchies, with the US's history of limiting access to financial capital to non-white people, particularly black folks. All of this eventually led eugenicists between the 1900s and 1960s in the US to try to appeal to white middle-class women to become more family-minded, meaning spit out more babies, in order to help better the race, thus being used to deny birth control to women, leading to the current mindset of anti-abortion attitudes that we see today in the US, which is understood in the modern-day anti-trans movement, as any anti-abortion groups like the Heritage Foundation also generally support anti-trans medical care. Black and indigenous women also throughout US history, and lower class women, even white women, forced into prostitution, were also deemed lesser women and thus argued to have to be sterilized. An estimated 70,000 indigenous women were sterilized in the 1970s, alongside 20,000 Mexican and Mexican American women in California alone at that time. And 31.6% of African American women without a high school diploma were reportedly also sterilized in states like North Carolina. Much of America's own eugenicist movement went on to influence, as well as be influenced by, the Nazis themselves, with the Nazis looking to California as a model for their own eugenicist movements pre-World War II, despite many post-World War II United States historians attempting to portray these two eugenicist movements as distinct, and the US's one ending right around the time that World War II began. In actuality, it has many far-reaching implications to this day for US policy and society.
Blasting a private detention center's COVID response. The 27-page complaint is partly based on information provided by a licensed nurse who worked at the facility in Southeast Georgia. Team 12's Doug Richards reports on the claims, including disturbing allegations of forced hysterectomies performed on detainees.
All of this goes to show that it is not white upper-class women who often face sterilization efforts stemming from children trying to be themselves, but in actuality, racialized minority groups being targeted by fascist, eugenicist, and racist movements buttressed by the United States' history of colonialism and slavery.
This is also why the right wing pushes for anti-abortion legislation to force white women to become baby-making factories, not caring for the, quote, sanctity of life, but the continuation of certain racial bloodlines.
It also showcases how denying someone access to being seen as a full woman, saying that they are less of a woman, or just people putting on woman face or lesser women, justifies hatred, bigotry, and state-sponsored violence, as we currently see being wielded against trans people today, but has historically been wielded against many marginalized groups throughout history.
Films like this also play into the eugenic-style fears of white women reproducing and having children with black men, diluting the colonizers' racial purity. I recommend FD Signifier's recent great video on interracial relationships for more on that.
Further, this connects to the anti-trans narratives that focus on Jewish influences on young girls' fertility, as the anti-trans narratives often hyper-focus on the blood libel and the transgender agenda on trans men's ability to reproduce.
It's destroyed my health. I don't know if I'll ever be able to conceive a child.
It goes to this eugenicist idea that we must continue one's bloodline at all costs. And these connections are not incidental, but interlinked. For example, take Elon Musk's obsession with having as many children as possible and his concern about the collapsing birth rate.
Doing my best to help the underpopulation crisis. A collapsing birth rate is the biggest danger civilization faces by far.
By civilization here, Musk means Western civilization. This ties into Musk's views of long-termism, a fear of the end of civilization, and thus one must reproduce as much as possible, leading Musk to, as of the time of this filming, have had 9 children across several relationships. Side note, I would also recommend this video by Some More News on that ideology, by the way. However, one of Musk's children came out as trans, Vivian Jenna Wilson, who expressed her desire in court to no longer have Musk be legally recognized as her father. Musk, whenever he talks about her, continually speaks about Vivian as if he lost her, framing her as his possession, and afterwards became actively anti-trans online.
She went beyond socialism to being a full communist and thinking that anyone rich is evil.
His parental desire for control and a desire to further his own bloodlines over all else eventually isolated him from his then partner at the time, Grimes, who reportedly left him in part due to his anti-trans stances. From there, Musk has also simultaneously platformed anti-trans works like What is a Woman, while also explicitly making the same connections to secret organizations controlling transgender healthcare, and has also publicly discussed his view that Big Pharma was influencing the rise of transgender awareness. Connecting to this more overtly, Musk has recently begun targeting the Anti-Defamation League, a Jewish group aimed at fighting anti-Semitism. Just as a side note, because I know if I don't mention it, the Anti-Defamation League is a complicated organization in terms of its politics, especially as it relates to Israel and Palestine.
The main issue being how the ADL conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, in a way that is itself anti-Semitic because it relates all of Jewish people to the actions of Israel, which erases the many Jewish people who do speak up against the actions of Israel, and that Israel the state is not the same as Jewish people generally. And it should be said that Israel is currently enacting a genocide against the Palestinian people.
However, I do encourage you to learn more about the Anti-Defamation League and their numerous complex issues in the links below. The main thing to point out is how Musk is literally pointing at a Jewish-led group and saying, hey, you're the people influencing my loss of money. A very clear anti-Semitic trope.
If somebody's gonna try to blackmail me with advertising, blackmail me with money, go f yourself. But go f yourself.
Also, I'm going to pause here because this brings me to a brief but important aside that I will eventually tie back into our larger themes. Recently, I did a video about creators who support Israel's actions in their ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people. And in that video, I used the term Zionist to describe those creators' pro-Israeli views on Israel's current actions in Gaza. And while I stand by what I say in the video 100%, and the views I described supporting Israel's actions are, as stated in that video, a form of Zionism, there is a tad bit of nuance there that I didn't clarify that I want to do so now. And that is that first and foremost, Zionist and Zionism have been terms long used as interchangeable with Jewish people by anti-Semitic groups on all parts of the political spectrum in order to dog whistle their bigotry as well as generate said anti-Semitism within left and right-wing spaces that don't make an intentional distinguishment between Zionism and Jewish people in order to create a radicalization pipeline similar to the one that we've been talking about within anti-trans viewpoints in liberal and left-leaning spaces throughout this video. These dog whistles have been getting much more play recently due to the renewed violence and genocidal actions by Israel towards the Palestinian people after Hamas's horrific attack and war crimes done on October 7th. When posts say Zionists are supporting genocide, the unconscious, or sometimes conscious, anti-Semitism in society will fill in that phrase with Jews are supporting genocide. While I make clear that that is not how I was using the term Zionist within my video, and also made clear my distinction between pro-Israeli support and Judaism as a whole in that video as well, it is a clarification that I want to re-emphasize here since we're discussing a similar issue as it relates to the ADL. And even further, even within the Jewish community, there are rampant debates about what Zionism even is.
Zionism has a complex history and numerous definitions. Some have understood it as a settler colonialist endeavor. Others make a distinction saying that Zionism was about the removing of the native population rather than the exploitation of the Palestinians, which, while technically not falling under the definition of a colonialist endeavor, can still be categorized as having parallels with an ethnic cleansing, which as part of its definition contains the concept of the forced displacement of a population. Yet still others, even those who are anti-Israel, argue that Zionism was, and can possibly still be, not an inherently colonialist ideology, but simply is describing a desire for Jewish people to be able to exist for themselves and dictate their own autonomy. Some Jewish folks argue that Zionism can be considered separate from a settler colonialist endeavor and be seen solely through the desire for self-autonomy and a homeland for Jewish people, while others argue that it has always inherently from its origins been tied to a desire to displace or remove Palestinian people, while still others argue that while Zionism was intrinsically tied to the land of Israel, that it also included coexistence with Palestinian people. I don't have an answer, nor is there one answer to what Zionism is, as different groups, both Gentiles and Jewish people, understand it differently. Yet, what I can say is this. Jewish people, both as a group and as individuals, having a desire for self-autonomy as a group is an understandable feeling. Given the bigotry, violence, and racialization Jewish people have faced for centuries, most notably and recently in the Holocaust. Sadly, this understandable feeling was manipulated by the imperial core to create a colonialist project in Israel that was backed by Western nations like the UK and the US to help it be formed, in order for them to gain a friendly, powerful ally within the Middle East to help better secure their own resource interests in the region at the direct expense of the Palestinian people who have been facing genocide since the Israeli formation and the Nakba.
It's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest.
Yes, America would have to invent an Israel, Biden, but thankfully for you, I guess, the United Kingdom helped do that for you. While the emotional connection many Jewish people have to the land that Israel was formed upon, as well as the emotional connection to the idea of having a homeland and refuge from the persecution they continue to face to this day, does not solely come from propaganda due to that land's long religious and historical importance to many Jewish groups, Israel, the nation as a colonialist project, has also worked for decades now to create propaganda that emotionally connects its existence as a nation directly to the emotional, cultural, and spiritual identity of Jewish people, both within Jewish people and communities themselves, as well as propaganda to the Gentiles in the world at large. Take, for example, some of the birthright trips, which allow Jewish people from across the world to be able to freely visit Israel for a trip in their youth, that are funded by pro-Israeli anti-Palestinian groups.
And I really think if this were about sharing Jewish culture and just having people make aliyah and building the population of Israel, there wouldn't be the stringent age limit that there is. And there's a limit for going on birthright if you've been to Israel before for any longer than 3 months. So not only do they want these young people to go who could get married and make Jewish babies, or who could, provide service to the IOF, but they want folks to not have a significant background on the state of Israel or to have spent much time there before they attend, which I think also speaks to the potential brainwashing, like the socialization effort that is being made by these Zionist organizations and funders.
You can see this quite clearly today when President Biden says things like,
"Folks, were there no Israel, there wouldn't be a Jew in the world who was safe. Were there no Israel?"
Leaving the implication that even in the United States, Jewish people should not feel safe unless Israel exists. He's the president of the United States and could spend his time saying Jewish people can and should be able to feel safe within this country that I am the leader of, which would set a tone for the entire country. But instead, he plays off the existing anti-Semitism within the United States to make Jewish people feel like they need to have an Israel to be able to have self-determination and survive, so that he as the president of the United States can continue to have political support to send funds, weapons, and his own political support to Israel. We can also see how the horrific war crimes like those done by Hamas on October 7th, both the real actual horrible war crimes that they did perpetuate on that day and before it, as well as the disinformation created about said events, are then used to prey upon Jewish people's understandable fears that they have after their own centuries of facing oppression and attacks, in order to attempt to elicit Jewish people's support and defense of the colonialist project against Palestinians, both in the name of Judaism and in fighting Hamas.
And yes, before you ask, of course I do condemn Hamas and their horrific war crimes both on, before, and after October 7th. The killing of civilians is unconscionable, and I certainly understand Jewish people being absolutely terrified upon seeing the killing of Jewish people on that day. including potentially many of their friends and family members, and how it touches upon real feelings of bigotry, violence, and genocide that Jewish people have faced throughout history. However, I also condemn the war crimes Israel did before and after October 7th as well, and the issue is that Israel has not seemed to do much to distinguish between Hamas the group and Palestinians as a whole, and is using the trauma that Jewish people feel to help to elicit an emotional reaction that perpetuates their killing of Palestinian civilians. We can even see how figures like Netanyahu consistently delegitimize any non-Hamas Palestinian organization in order to make it easier to equate Hamas with all Palestinians. And again, I wish to be very clear, because some people feel like I haven't been, I do condemn the war crimes that Hamas has done, even while I support the Palestinian people and understand that Israel is using Hamas as a way to perpetuate their colonialist project, and it is on Israel, the nation that is the aggressor in this situation, to be able to call for a ceasefire and stop said colonialist efforts overall. Long and short, while I do not support Israel, nor as an anarchist do I believe in the right of any nation, Israel or otherwise, to exist, and also know that Zionism has been over the decades turned into almost exclusively being about a pro-Israeli stance, many anti-Israeli Jewish folks have complex feelings about the term, its history separate from Israel as a colonialist project, and how it has been used today by both Israel itself as well as anti-Semites dog-whistling their anti-Semitism. Now, obviously, everything that I just said is just a primer of a much larger, nuanced conversation that we could have, but one that I simply wish to clarify after my recent video. Still, I wanted to bring up this clarification around Zionism as a term within this video because we can see in this history how there has been a manipulation of understandable anxieties and fears that Jewish people have after centuries of bigotry, as well as the twisting of their actual right and desire for safety and security to live as their true selves by the colonialist imperial core to propagandize and instill a sense that the Jewish identity is interchangeable with a colonialist project like the Israeli ethno-state. We can even see how arguments over the usage of a term like Zionism, such as the ones that sprung out of my video due to my lack of specific clarification in that video, which I should have done by the way, on how I use the term to describe the current main cultural discourse surrounding pro-Israeli viewpoints stemming from said belief in the need for Israel to exist at the expense of Palestinians, in distinction from how far-right anti-Semites have used the term, or its pre-Israel ethno-state effort origins, have then been used to distract and deflect from the larger point, as well as attack both Jewish people generally, as well as those, both Jewish and Gentile, speaking up in support of the Palestinian people, and thus, in the chaos, enabling said settler colonialist efforts to continue. While all of this has a very specific history as it tied into centuries of anti-Semitic propaganda, something that I would urge you to educate yourself on through such works like the wonderful Dead Domains video on the topic, we can see through all of this the desire by colonialist nations to use fear and anxiety stemming from generated bigotries and prejudices that colonialism itself created in the first place into being used to justify further marginalization and bigotry of other minorities. We can see that this is a constant underlying dynamic of utilizing anxiety stoked by colonialism itself to then target more marginalized groups and continue imperialist efforts. All of this is not one for one, but we can see a similar dynamic here in how both gender-critical feminist anxieties as cisgender women living in a patriarchal society are manipulated to attack transgender people and thus uphold a colonialistic understanding of gender hierarchies through things such as the fight around the term "what is a woman?", when woman, as it's understood as a concept in Western nations, was itself generated to be able to create a feminized, subjugated underclass that distinguished itself against racialized minorities. As well as in how someone like Elon Musk, who by every metric is one of the most singularly privileged, safe, and powerful men in the entire world, can still have his fear and anxieties at his identity as a white man be manipulated for more overt white supremacist ends that ultimately support colonialism. There are even attempts to solicit these same motivations within the LGBTQ community, such as how there have been movements to split LGBT people from the transgender movement by assimilationist queer folks who don't wish to stand in solidarity with trans people at the expense of their precariously and nominal rights that they've earned over the past few years in our society, such as marriage equality.
LGB is about relationships. It's about love, it's about sex, it's about who you're attracted to. Are you attracted to men? Are you attracted to women? Or are you attracted to both? It's very clear sexual orientation. T and Q and all the other letters that have been added since then are about identity issues. They're completely separate and it's caused a lot of confusion. It's lesbians who have suffered from the addition of the T to LGB. And I think your subtitle perhaps should be reading, "Campaigners argue that the gay community has been hijacked."
Or how whenever a queer person speaks up against Israel, a response that you will typically see will be, well, you know, Palestinians would kill you as a queer person, in an attempt to bully us for standing up for Palestinians by preying upon queer people's desire to fight back against bigotry that is targeted against us, which deliberately, 1, ignores that queer and pro-queer Palestinians exist, 2, preys upon Islamophobic biases that Middle Eastern folks are inherently more queerphobic, which isn't true, 3, ignores that living under an oppressive regime like those that Palestinians in Gaza have been subjugated to isn't exactly the best environment that fosters social progressivism, and 4, that even if most Palestinians were anti-queer, that still wouldn't justify their genocide. The point that I am making is that by an attempt to try to make marginalized groups who have been targeted for their marginalized status feel like they can earn some sort of assimilation into society by then targeting other minorities who are seen as quote-unquote below them, these imperialist desires can be perpetuated. And that ties into fascism because fascism is just colonialism turned inwards. And just to say it though, the distinction to be clear between Elon Musk and others whom we're talking about is that Elon Musk supporting white supremacy does not harm his position in a hierarchy, and in fact reinforces his position as an upper-class white man who comes directly from a family that has benefited from the exploitation of colonialist countries, as well as the working class in the United States and elsewhere. In contrast to that, anti-transgender cisgender women activists like J.K. Rowling are ultimately reinforcing women's place as lesser in a binary dichotomy of men and women when they attack transgender women under the guise of, quote, supporting women's sex-based rights. As well as how when people conflate Israel's colonialist actions with Judaism in the name of Jewish self-determination, they are in fact perpetuating anti-Semitism.
And shows while the far right is attempting to use this situation to smuggle in anti-Semitism into our discourses, anti-Semitism is not exclusive to right-wing spaces, but can be left-wing as well.
Thus, we can see, similar to how we've been talking about in this entire video, anti-trans rhetoric is used to funnel people into fascistic propaganda, how these top-of-funnel anti-Semitic viewpoints are then used to radicalize people into further bigoted worldviews. Take, for example, how Republicans have attempted to blame anti-Semitic rhetoric that has grown post-October 7th on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, with numerous conservative lawmakers in the US having held several hearings on anti-Semitism where they take the time to blame DEI for said anti-Semitism, with folks like Utah Republican Chair of the House Higher Educational Subcommittee saying, "I think DEI is a fraud and what we're seeing now on campuses is proof of that," referring to anti-Semitic hate crimes on college campuses as well as marches against Israeli violence, again conflating actual anti-Semitism with anti-Israeli viewpoints in order to attack programs to benefit BIPOC and other marginalized folks here in the United States, as well as vilify Palestinian people.
What I'm describing is a grave danger inherent in assenting to the race-based ideology of the radical left. Senator Schumer hasn't put the pieces together, but the picture is far too clear now to American Jews. Institutional anti-Semitism and hate are among the poison fruits of your institution's cultures.
By doing this, Republicans here are also taking advantage of the failure of leftist movements to treat Jewish people as a legitimate minority where Jews are often not considered in the term diversity. Again, this is why, while we should be speaking up for Palestinian people right now, we need to make very clear the distinguishment between pro-Israeli stances as well as Jewish people, as that lack of clarification ultimately can be wielded by anti-Semitic and fascistic movements, both within the far-right and left-wing spaces. While there are numerous far-right influences spreading anti-Semitism, it's not just far-right influences complicit in anti-Semitism within those speaking up against Palestinian genocide, as, again, to emphasize, we should consistently and constantly be doing from the top of our lungs. But the failure to take anti-Semitism seriously has left a huge opening for the far right to fill, not to mention one that allows them to distance themselves from the Nazi-style groups that they're courting the favor of. While this video is going to mainly go back to focusing on how anti-transness is a top-of-funnel radicalizing force, we can see here how there are many entry points intended to bring people to the same fascistic supporting actions. And I'd recommend this Vox article for more information on how anti-Semitism is used to vilify DEI programs, as well as court Jewish people who have fallen into pro-Israeli propaganda and feel ostracized by the lack of clarification and distinguishment between Zionism, pro-Israeli people, and Jewish folks.
I'd also highly recommend Some More News' recent video titled Elon Musk's Hitler Problem for more on how Elon Musk has very clear Nazi sympathetic ties. A video in which the amazingly bearded Cody Johnston also notes that part of the reason that Elon Musk fell down through these ties was in part due to his transphobic feelings. Also, worth mentioning, since this video was filmed, Elon Musk has doubled down on his anti-Semitism, leading to more advertisers to leave the Twitter platform, angering Elon Musk even more, causing him to fall further and further into anti-woke rhetoric. But even further, Musk has platformed far-right and anti-trans groups on his Twitter site repeatedly and enabled hate speech while allegedly causing accounts discussing transgender issues or even using the word trans to either be banned or deprioritized in the algorithm, as well as removing tools for trans people to be able to report anti-trans hatred, thus marginalizing numerous trans voices on his platform. And I can speak very directly to this, increasing the hate that many trans people will face. Like quite literally, ever since Elon Musk has taken over, every single thing that I tweet has somehow become controversial, whether it be about actual controversial topics or whether or not, I ship Mobius and Loki in the recent season of Disney Plus's Loki. It all goes to show how continually all of these things go to frame trans people as ridiculous, as controversial, when we're really just trying to be people just like anyone else. All of these viewpoints become intertwined, with the powerful like Elon Musk worrying more about controlling their status quo and bloodline, controlling every aspect of the world and people around them, including their children, leading them to more overt bigotries, leaning into fascistic narratives and conspiracy theories. All of this, everything that we've been discussing this entire video, is built on an anxiety of being at the top of a hierarchy, be it a parent and child relationship or a billionaire and the working class relationship, and a fear of losing that position and finding reasons to explain why you're losing that position and how you can reassert it. This is what hierarchical systems do. They create an anxiety of those at the top that ultimately will lead those in that powerful position to constantly side with that position over all others, and viewing others beneath them as trying to come and take them down, when really most of us are just arguing for an egalitarian society. Musk is just one of the most high-profile examples.
I do also think there is an element where the reason I think a lot of people want to keep anti-Semitism veiled is because there is a general attitude, even among right-wingers. I literally got a comment the other day that said, I think word for word, they're trying to make white the new Jew. It sounded like a bizarre white replacement thing. And then immediately, period, I'm not a white supremacist. It was just like, oh, wow. But it's... a lot of people don't want to think that about themselves. They're like, I'm not a Nazi. I'm not like Hitler. I'm not that bad, because there's still enough media. Like, everybody likes Indiana Jones, and Indiana Jones says, I hate Nazis. Mm-hmm. So there's still, up to a point, up till you get to like fucking Proud Boys, there are a lot of people who I think want that plausible deniability of like, well, we're not like that. So they'll be, I think, a lot more veiled, walk right up to the edge of what's acceptable. I think like what you were describing in the movie, they're being more veiled because then they can have plausible deniability. We're not like those people. We just think these people are all evil and should die.
Yeah.
Not at all like that.
Nothing like that. Yeah. This is how a system works on individuals. So when we say that there is a systemic problem that continually creates people like Elon Musk or Donald Trump, this is what we mean. These systems will place these people into positions of power and then stoke in them anxieties that people are coming to get them and take away their powerful position. Thus, they end up continually reinforcing it with violence, be it racist, anti-Semitic, transphobic, sexist, or something else. Musk and our cultural fascination with him is just one of the most high-profile examples. The problems that he showcases are some of the most blatantly bigoted and obvious, but he is emblematic of the entire system doing this to people like him. This is the exact reason, by the way, why you'll even see capital L liberal people in the trans community and the queer community who have an assimilationist view of how trans and queer people should exist in our society start blaming the radical left for the current targeting of trans rights by Republicans and fascists, rather than the fascist Nazis and Republicans. Again, sorry, I repeated myself 3 times there.
Transgenderism is a mental health disorder.
Because these capital L liberal trans and queer people see the system failing and how how trans and queer people are being targeted as a result, and get internalized anxiety about how they are going to lose their admittedly hard-fought-for accepted position within the system as binary identified trans people and queer people whose acceptance was always nominal and conditional upon the fact that they repeat the values of a white supremacist system. Thus, out of this anxiety, they blame the trans and queer people fighting for a wider understanding and acceptance of trans people on our own terms outside of the dictates of how the system tries to tell us to exist, and see this criticism and attack of the system that rejects conformity with it, that these assimilationists fought so hard to even be a conditional part of, as an attack against themselves. This is why if you see a trans person agreeing with white supremacists, it's not so much their opinion as a trans person as it is their opinion as a white supremacist. While I'm talking very broadly and briefly here, this dynamic within the trans and queer community is something I am going to be doing a larger video on in the future, because if you think I'm talking about a specific person here, I'm not. I'm actually thinking of several, and I'm seeing it play out more and more lately as our system continually fails and attempts to reassert itself with fascist actions by introducing anxiety within those who feel their position slipping due to the nominal acceptance being pulled away as they are scapegoated. It's also worth going back and looking at who appears in gender transformations as a specific example of how anti-trans narratives function in conjunction with financial interests, as Musk himself as a billionaire underscores how many anti-trans views align with privatized financial interests as well.
Amplifying
free speech is not
certain
exactly
voices.
free, it costs a little bit.
Right, but that's it. But that's an interesting.
You know, it's like in South Park where they say, you know, freedom isn't free, it costs $1.05.
Pamela Garfield, for example, is simply presented as a former teacher and social worker. However, if you look into her, she used to work at Stutter Health and lost her job after she attempted to spread anti-vaccine information. She now also works as an ambassador for Turning Point USA, an organization that promotes anti-Semitic beliefs and conspiracy theories run by Charlie Kirk, a person who has many far-right ties and spreads many far-right beliefs. We can also mention Erin Friday, who is only described as a mother and lawyer in the film, but who openly admits to having sent her trans mask-identifying child to conversion therapy camps and saying, quote, "I sent her to camps where she would have to do physical work all day long, like a labor camp." She has also worked to attack legislation supporting reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy for women generally. Callie Fontanilla is only presented in the film as a, quote, former teacher, but she is also the founder of the Exodus Institute. The Exodus Institute is an online homeschooling program teaching such non-political content as American values and the best conservative colleges to attend, or counter critical race theory programming. All not political at all. It's very clear that Callie has a vested financial interest in vilifying public education, something that films like Gender Transformations and anti-trans narratives do implicitly in order to funnel people into their right-wing propaganda. But this ends up being an Ouroboros working upon itself, as when many right-wing groups fall into educational homeschooling programs run by right-wing organizations like the Exodus Institute or PragerU, these programs work to spew back at these children further right-wing talking points. Again, that funnel that just keeps people in their own ecosystem. I contacted my wonderful YouTube colleague Zoe B, whose content often focuses on education and the right-wing influence upon it, to discuss how this right-wing vilification of public education works more generally in our culture.
If you look at the Exodus Institute website, that is something that they say is like, you know, if you want to use this fully accredited K-12 program, contact us, see if we can get you a voucher depending on where you're at. And that's, I'm going to try really hard to like avoid the boring stuff, but how do I even talk about this without like getting into tax law? It's so boring.
It's boring intentionally though, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So charter schools take public money, and many private schools do as well through what's called school vouchers. And that is where, if you see this being said by right-wing figures, they often say, fund students, not systems, which sounds great.
Yeah.
Like from my perspective, like, hell yeah.
Great, yeah.
Humanize students, they're great. Let's make sure that they're... No, what it means is that all of the taxes that you pay for public education should not go to the school, but should be tied to individual students. And if those individual students decide to go to a private school instead of a public school, that funding should stay with them. And so they should get a voucher to be able to go to a private school. There are companies whose whole purpose is to funnel money from public coffers into private institutions. And when those private companies or nonprofits do that in several states, they can get a dollar-for-dollar tax refund or tax reimbursement from the state, and it's a write-off on their federal taxes, which means, if you can do math, they get to double dip, which means they can turn a profit on taking money out of the public, like your taxes that you are paying.
They take money out of the public system and then pay less into the public in the in the back end too.
Yeah, so they're double dipping.
It's decreasing public funding overall in every sense.
Yes. So the whole thing is just super sketchy, tied up in all of this culture war nonsense, and makes a lot of money. Like, there are a lot of these kinds of programs that will make millions and millions of dollars a year. And of course, because the people who own these are the kind of people who would do this, they use those millions of dollars to lobby politicians to have lighter regulations on these kinds of institutes so they're allowed to keep doing what they're doing. On top of this, these politicians who are very anti-Department of Education are also anti-teachers unions, because they see teachers unions as being bullies who are, hurting students in order to get, they're so greedy and all they want is more money and they want to be able to control politicians. And teachers shouldn't be politically active. They should be neutral. The good news and the bad news is that this war on public education so far has not been successful. People tend to like schools and think that they're a good thing. And so it's been really hard for all of these politicians to convince people that this is a good thing and this is a platform worth electing someone on. And so what I see as the angle for this whole culture war stuff in education that's going on right now is that is their way of hooking people into finally getting rid of public education. So it's wild that it's this very obvious hypocrisy where you have these millionaires who are running these charter schools who are making money and lobbying politicians, and yet actual teachers in public schools, they're trying to take all power from them and vilify them in all of the ways that you mentioned of they're grooming your kids, they're turning your kids trans, etc., etc.
As the Exodus Institute and places like PragerU's recent encroachment on homeschool and public education curriculum shows, the educational goals that these groups push ultimately uphold an American first rhetoric.
You know it's only kid shows, so you have some peace of mind. But as you eat the roasted goose, your little sport insists.
Hey Dad, did you know America is racist?
Your mind goes numb, your skin turns pale, and your heart aches with fear. Your child is being filled with lies, the babe you once held dear. But in that shocking moment, a man pops into frame. Could it be George Washington, here to save your child's brain? He snatched the screen and changed the thing to something that is true. It's an app with shows for kids. They call it PragerU. There's content for your child's mind to fight the leftist lies. And if you give your child a chance to watch and think and grow, they might burst forth like Washington, a true American hero. Think better, live better. Visit PragerUkids.com for free kids shows, cartoons, and books that teach classic American values.
Even further, they prop up the financial goal of these institutions as well, with PragerU, the Exodus Institute, and groups like the Daily Wire or Epoch Times all making money on these educational resources.
In 2023, we're going to make our first major step to meet our impossibly ambitious goal, 10 million active subscribers, starting with the launch of DW Kids.
We can also see this same thing in Florida's assault on public education, and the right-wing's denial of education around Americans' history of systemic racism, attacking things like critical race theory, instead arguing for the regrettable yet beneficial history of slavery.
Sure. Do you see a difference between the sexualized material, the gender conversation, multiple genders, etc., versus American history, slavery, that kind of? I just wonder how you see it.
Oh yeah, I think in this debate and in this conversation, all these things get lumped together.
Absolutely.
And so, but there's no doubt Republican officials, office holders, are hearing daily from parents who have grown quite concerned about this. So they're, as a tactical matter, they're responding to that.
Ultimately, we can see how this vilification of the American public education system through culture war narratives of a transgender agenda or other racialized narratives not only works to uphold an interest in privatized capitalist drives, but even more so, ultimately, the project of creating a mythological version of American nationalism that further fuels fascistic rhetoric, as writer Jason Stanley points out in his book, How Fascism Works.
Fascist politics seeks to undermine public discourse by attacking and devaluing education, expertise, and language. Intelligent debate is impossible without an education with access to different perspectives, a respect for expertise when one's own knowledge gives out, and a rich enough language to precisely describe reality. When education, expertise, and linguistic distinctions are undermined, there remains only power and tribal identity. This does not mean that there is no role for universities in fascist politics. In fascist ideology, there is only one legitimate viewpoint, that of the dominant nation. Schools introduce students to the dominant culture and its mythic past. Education, therefore, either poses a grave threat to fascism or becomes a pillar of support for the mythical nation.
It's worth noting that Jason Stanley himself often will support neoliberalist policies and will sometimes conflate fascism and communism within his work. However, I do think it's worthwhile to look at his work as a great overview at the underpinnings of fascistic thought. Just like how gender transformations directs viewers into Epoch TV subscriptions, all of these right-wing narratives continually channel people further into privatized interests that send out the same exact rhetoric. This brings us back to the initial point. It does not matter how far down the funnel you go, just that you enter it somewhere, because you'll eventually end up in these same spaces that continually vilify anything outside of a hegemonic American far-right viewpoint that lays its foundations on eugenics, viewing women as only there for reproduction, anti-Semitic beliefs, racist propaganda, anti-queer and anti-trans hate, and more.
The politics of deference focuses on the consequences that are likeliest to show up in the rooms where elites do most of their interacting, classrooms, boardrooms, political parties. As a result, we seem to end up with far more and more specific practical advice about how to, say, allocate tasks at a committee meeting than how to keep people alive. Deference as a default political orientation can work counter to marginalized groups' interests. We are surrounded by a discourse that locates attentional injustice in the selection of spokespeople and book lists taken to represent the marginalized, rather than focusing on the actions of the corporations and algorithms that much more powerfully distribute attention. This discourse ultimately participates in the weaponization of attention in the service of marginalization. It directs what little attentional power we can at symbolic sites of power, rather than at the root political issues that explain why everything is so fucked up.
In conjunction with corporate interests, though, we should also mention how much of the anti-trans groups we see also come from the religious Christian right in the United States. While gender transformations remains overtly secular in its approach, and many prominent gender-critical feminists such as Helen Joyce are atheists, their work almost always makes allusions to Christianity. The language of bodies being precious, divine, unassailable dovetail often with Catholic rhetoric of bodies being God's alone to control and define, and the control of pushing women and trans men into fundamentalist roles as caregiver and mother are shared themes.
I know who I am and I want to be who I am and I want you to love me for that.
Honey, I love you.
You love the girl that you gave birth to.
God gave you this amazing body, and you want to change it.
I'm your son.
Sweetie, you're confused. It's crazy.
No.
The US Christian right generally has spent nearly $280 million between the years 2008 and 2019 in order to attack LGBTQ rights worldwide, honing in recently in the past few years on gender propaganda, in their words, helping lead to anti-trans attacks in places like Uganda and Hungary. The US-based Alliance Defending Freedom has also spent millions in the US and Europe alone and defended laws in 2015 that required sterilizing transgender people. Atheist, gender-critical feminists like Helen Joyce may argue that they are making a secular argument, as she does at the end of her unimaginatively titled book Trans, and gender transformations itself may not ever say Christianity, but it's there all the same, often lurking in the background like it is in the mise-en-scène of the film. And none of this is to mention how forcing specific gender roles onto people and anti-trans legislation on the basis of it being protecting religious freedom denies the right of the freedom of religion to many indigenous, Jewish, and other groups who have attempted to argue so in court, often with little success. All of us, everything we're discussing should go to show you that this is not an individualized problem caused by specific actors, or an issue facing transgender people alone, but a system that has numerous different entry points, of which transphobia is but one, that all still have the same incentives rooted within colonialist, capitalist, and religious fundamentalist goals. We can see this very clearly with someone like Miriam Grossman. But if Miriam looks familiar to you, it's because Matt Walsh, an admitted capitalist and fundamentalist Christian, had her appear in his own anti-trans film, What is a Woman?, where she shared the same exact story about John Money that she shared in Gender Transformations.
Money was telling the world about his theory that a boy could be raised as a girl and do just fine, and vice versa. In fact, the only study intended to prove this theory of gender identity being separate from biology failed miserably, and that was the study that John Money did with the famous twins, the Reamer twins.
Her appearance in both is notable because it highlights how incestuous these seemingly distinct narratives are continually proffering up the same supposed experts and institutions in spite of the large amounts of scientific research being gathered over time. People like Miriam Grossman continually crop up because they are one of the few people that are willing to sell their soul to pretend to be experts for this hateful bigotry. We can also see this very clearly with the detransitioners who appear in the film. If we look into it, we see that many of these detransitioners, like Chloe Cole, that appear in Gender Transformations belong to the group The Transition Justice Project, which includes Scott Nugent, who himself appeared in What is a Woman? The Transition Justice Project is one of a few different detransitioner-led groups that are often funded by right-wing groups in order to generate a narrative and media around detransition and generate specific legal rights battles targeting transgender healthcare using detransitioner stories as the argument to do so. The aforementioned Lee Levine, one of the founding members of one such group of detransitioners, the Gender Care Consumer Advocacy Network, spoke about how she saw the group continually be manipulated by anti-trans interests, and her life and personhood only viewed through the lens of how her detransitioner trauma could be useful to those goals. I'd recommend reading her entire story that's linked below, but here is a specific part of it related to what we're talking about right now.
GECCAN officially launches just in time for fundraising season, and guess where a majority of the donations came from? Parents, gender-critical or radical feminists, and shady practitioners such as Lisa Marciano. At least in the beginning, the funding is all grassroots from concerned citizens, end quote. While it may change as the groups grow and attract big donors, it's crucial to understand how they get started because influence starts with swaying the minds of the public. Tug on the heartstrings enough and they'll lower their guard and accept shadier deals. And what do you do when you want to tug on heartstrings? You talk about kids and tragic backstories. My most valuable asset to the group wasn't my knowledge or skill set in patient rights advocacy, it was my medical trauma as a transmasculine person. While my skills and my public platform were important to the organization's initial development, essential even, it paled in comparison to the benefits brought by the emotional appeal of my story. Any supports I would have needed in that organization, I would have had to develop myself, as no one else shared the commitment. I also felt that my sense of self as a transmasculine butch wasn't taken seriously, a feeling that was later confirmed by others who had left connected scenes. Despite my leaving the organization, the machine lives on. Grace Lidinsky-Smith and her new role as president pursued the connections with Lisa Littman I had opposed. She interviewed Littman to promote her new study, even though her past paper was designed to prove a pre-established theory and the detrans people she collaborated with were already firm believers in rapid onset gender dysphoria. Detrans activist Laura, aka Floor Fritz, released a message of hope aimed at British trans youth without medical care after the Bell v. Tavistock anti-trans ruling that removed access to puberty blockers, featuring contributions by both Lidinsky-Smith and Callahan. This despite the fact that both Lidinsky-Smith and Callahan celebrated the ruling in contradiction to previous public and private statements. A new void was created, so of course here they come to the rescue. Marciano, of course, is making preparations to present at an upcoming conference alongside Jennifer, the Jews, Soros and Pritzkers are transing the youth, Bilek, Julie Bindel, and Marcus and Susan Evans, also of SEGM. Funny that. And now, WOLF has confessed to coordinating legal efforts to bring the repercussions of the Bell v. Tavistock case to the United States.
Lee's story highlights how often small pools of detransitioners are found, pushed together, and then used to manufacture the supposed concern around detransition that is used to prop up anti-trans narratives. While many detransitioner groups may start off innocently enough to advocate, as I did earlier in this video, for detransitioner rights, they quite often get directly linked up through funding efforts to larger right-wing organizations or figures looking to use them. And then these groups become so reliant on these financial interests that they begin to tokenize themselves. Yet these financial and organizational networks are often so small that they can be easily mapped with the same names, even ones that we've been discussing through gender transformations, such as Dr. Michael Laidlaw, appearing repeatedly. Over and over and over again, different programs and stories claim to be concerned about the thousands of stories of the dangers of detransition that need to be heard, yet they are continually only able to find the same pool of people. Chloe Cole, Abel Garcia, Kat Caddison, and Scott Nugent repeatedly appear all over the globe to sell the same story, making it seem like a more significant issue. Chloe Cole, for example, has appeared not only in this Epoch Times documentary, but 7 News Australia, the Center for Bioethics and Cultural Networks, Fox News, Matt Walsh's anti-trans events, appeared with Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene in Washington, has appeared on stage at CPAC,
appeared on Jordan Peterson's show, Glenn Beck's show, as well as the Daily Signal show, spoke at the Young America's Foundation, and let's not forget PragerU, of course,
began a lawsuit in her home state of California against healthcare provider Kaiser Permanente, the same healthcare provider that I use, by the way, and given testimony in support of anti-trans affirming healthcare bills in Utah, Tennessee, Ohio, Kansas, Missouri, Montana, Louisiana, Idaho, South Dakota, and Florida,
Crete, Mauritania, then Transylvania, Monaco, Liechtenstein, Malta, and Palestine, Fiji, Australia, Sudan,
to name but a few of her numerous appearances over the past few years alone. A state lawmaker in Wyoming even named his law banning transition care for minors Chloe's Law after Chloe Cole, even though she's not from Wyoming. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida even told Chloe's story in his 2023 State of the State address, where she received a standing ovation.
Chloe Cole is now a young adult, but she was receiving puberty blockers at age 13, and she underwent a double mastectomy at age 16. She's now an advocate against allowing these procedures for our children. Chloe, thank you for your bravery, and the people of Florida and the legislature should heed your advice and provide protections against these procedures.
She literally just gets dragged from place to place in order to prop up hateful bigotries. It's honestly incredibly fucking sad. And I really mean that this is incredibly sad, because if you look into it, many detransitioners will tell a story of how, after they first decided to detransition, they fell into gender-critical anti-trans groups because they accepted them and were the only ones talking about detransition publicly. But then these groups would try to utilize their stories for their own ends, taking advantage of these detransitioners at a low and vulnerable time of their life.
I was looking for people who had similar experiences or had a more complicated transition story. I started looking online and then found some blogs by detrans women, which were pretty much all written by radical feminists. I had recently quit drugs and was learning to function in a healthy way as an adult. I was embittered because I'd had a bad experience in a queer house share that went wrong. I think feeling out of sorts in that space and feeling out of place made me easy pickings to be radicalized. What was really compelling was this idea that if I joined in, I could finally get over this pain I've been carrying. I could finally get over this trauma and feel better about myself. But like life, it didn't work like that.
Even further, these detransitioners then are often funneled into being utilized for these campaigns, having their stories propped up and wielded in front of media organizations, with these groups knowingly picking which information to present to a broad audience, as well as isolating these detransitioners from people around them who could love them and show them support beyond just wielding their story for hateful bigotries. It speaks to the cult-like isolation tactics that gender-critical and anti-trans groups use.
When I became a radical feminist, I had a kind of conversion experience. It was very powerful and emotionally intense. I embraced many views that I had previously dismissed or found repellent. I felt that adopting these beliefs had brought me deep healing. though it also turned my world upside down. It was both exciting and disorientating. I was full of passion for my new beliefs and was convinced that they could help other people as well. Dishonesty was normalized in the radical feminist detrans women's community. While some of us were more upfront with our views than others, most of us hid what we really thought from many of our friends and acquaintances. We thought they were too steeped in patriarchal culture or taken in by trans ideology to understand our views. If people did show any sign of being receptive to our beliefs, we would share what we thought they would find acceptable, but hold back anything they would find too extreme or offensive. I intentionally moderated my views in public in order to reach a larger audience and make my ideas less threatening. At the same time, I wanted to be challenging. I was trying to spread the idea that trans identity and transition could be motivated by trauma and internalized misogyny. I did nothing to reassure trans readers that I took their identity seriously, and that was intentional. I thought trans identities were already overly reinforced by the dominant culture, and I wanted to undermine them. I didn't directly attack them though, and I never came out and said they weren't real. I was trying to introduce the idea that trans identity could be caused by trauma or sexism without saying that they all were, though that's what I believed, and without saying anything about how some people really were trans.
Further, they are given funding to create targeted court cases against medical care, such as with the Bell v. Tavistock case, a case in the United Kingdom where a young detransitioner, Kiara Bell, was prescribed puberty blockers and had a double mastectomy and later regretted it, claiming that she was left with
no breasts, a deep voice, body hair, and affected sexual function.
Despite Kiara acknowledging that these were all things that she was warned about before these surgeries and treatments, she argued in court that the NHS Gender Identity Development Service should have denied her the care that she was allegedly rushed through. This despite the clear evidence that most transgender youth in the UK have to actually wait several years to receive such care. Yet, the court case eventually led to a temporary ban on puberty blockers for trans kids in the UK until it was repealed in 2021, but helped form the basis for the vilification of these treatments that eventually led to literally the Prime Minister of the UK spewing it in front of an audience who applauds as he denies transgender affirming care throughout his country.
They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
And Bell's case was not just isolated to the UK, but was a targeted effort by UK and US anti-trans groups. The Women's Liberation Front, a gender-critical group in the United States, had also used the Bell v. Tavistock case to lobby places like the Supreme Court against human rights protections for trans people, and stated that they care more for attacking trans rights than they do for women's healthcare issues like abortion, and who regularly work with the Heritage Foundation. The Women's Liberation Front also stated several years ago that they were working to bring similar cases like Bell's to the US, with Chloe Cole's recent case against Kaiser Permanente being one. Much of the same happens to parents looking for affirmations of their fears in gender-critical spaces that films like Gender Transformations prey upon. This is how cults get built. The cult finds an emotional fear or anxiety that people have about the world, anxieties often generated on these systems and power that we talked about earlier, and presents a narrative that not only validates this anxiety, but offers up a simple solution to resolve this emotional turmoil that not only alleviates the person from introspection, but leans into their already preconceived notions of how the world should work, often leaning into pre-existing hierarchies in the world around them that have continually been eroded by economic instability or increased visibility of marginalized groups. It's also why getting people to leave cults is incredibly tricky, especially when someone has been involved for them for a really long time. To pull them out would not only disrupt the way that they see the world, but they are also often emotionally and financially invested. The further they go in, the more the cult attempts to cut off its supporters from any alternatives to survive without that cult support. Every person or idea external to the cult's viewpoint is seen as sinister, a threat, and dangerous, and must be denied, eliminated, or controlled to be able to proffer up the cult's viewpoint on the world. This goes all the way from things like the gender-critical cult, all the way up to things like neoliberalism that we see today. A study of how conspiratorial ideas get generated described the mindsets that lead to such ideas, and it sounds oddly familiar, and describes why conspiratorial thinking that these anti-trans narratives build upon ultimately work brilliantly to move people to far-right conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic beliefs.
The strongest correlates of conspiratorial ideation across the motivational and personological domains pertain to the following tendencies. A. To perceive threat and danger. B. To rely on intuition and have odd beliefs and experiences. And C. to be antagonistic and feel superior. Such research will not only clarify how conspiratorial ideation develops, but also whether conspiratorial ideation satisfies the needs that draw people to conspiracy theories in the first place. It is possible, if not likely, that conspiracy theories are less satisfying than they are appealing. Consider anxiety as an example. As already noted, anxiety may spur people to turn to conspiracy theories, as conspiracy theories may, at first blush, provide certainty that people crave. Yet, conspiracy theories are inherently uncertain. After all, they are unproven, and they are, in many ways, anxiety-provoking. If a small group of nefarious individuals has the power to bring down buildings, governments, and societies, then how can people rest until everyone sees the light? Over time, conspiracy theories may increase the discomfort people were originally trying to mitigate, and even contribute to behaviors that increase a sense of discomfort. For instance, reluctance to engage in preventative medicine, potentially yielding a vicious cycle of anxiety and conspiratorial ideation.
Ultimately, the idea of an anti-trans agenda coming for your child will relieve parents' anxieties briefly. But when their child continues to be trans or suffers depression because they aren't being seen, these parents will continually look for more conspiracies to help them answer their continued and growing anxieties around their child. Epoch Times, or whatever far-right group has guided them into this anti-trans funnel, is more than happy to provide them with that next layer: anti-Semitism, racism, and more. And this is the same story we see with Abigail Martinez, a mother whose grief after losing her child, which itself was caused in part by her fears being manipulated by these groups, is then pulled into her gender-critical groups who then prop up and use her grief to propagandize hate, both in films like Gender Transformations, but also in gender-critical rallies that she regularly attends, to ghoulisly parade her trauma and grief through her distorted view of her son's life story.
Even though we don't like the fact that they disrupt us and that they're cruel. As Abigail Martinez stood up there talking about the suicide of her daughter, you could hear one of them saying, "Cry more."
While I ultimately have very little sympathy for parents who do this to their children, what these cult-like spaces do to these parents is ultimately quite sick. And ultimately it denies transgender children and all children from what they need and want most: just to have their parents see them.
I got a message from a young person whose actual mother was in one of the screenshots. They sent me the screenshot and they said, "I have access to my mother's Facebook. I know what she's saying about me. She just leaves it open on the living room computer or whatever. Thank you for censoring it because she's still my mom," which like killed me because I wasn't thinking about it like that. Because if that was me, I don't think I would have that feeling. But these children don't want to cut their parents off. They love their parents and they just want their parents to love them. Like that's all it is. They just want to be accepted. They just want to be seen for who they are and not as like somebody who's like disabled or diseased or manipulated. And I think that gets lost a lot when we're talking about these parents.
Yeah.
These children don't want to go to foster care. They don't want to have to run away. They don't want to do any of the things that gender critical people are saying that trans activists are trying to convince their children to do. What they want is for their parents to accept them, and that's it. Like that's all they want. The isolation is what's deadly.
Yeah.
And I like every single time that I've been in like a really dark place, it's because I felt alone. Because having like community around you, having people that care about you and tell you that and that support you is what makes difficult times survivable.
Yeah.
And in these groups, you will constantly see parents say that like their children are narcissists or they're manipulating them, that they are trying to use the emotional pleas as a form of like manipulation of like emotional blackmail. So like a child will be like, "I just want you to see me as I am. I just want you to love me as like for who I'm telling you I am." And they're like, "That's manipulation. Don't listen to it." And I think that's something that gets missed a lot, is that it's not just that the child wants to be affirmed is that they love their parents, and they want their parents to love them, not their idea of them, not what they decided that they were going to be before they were even born.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah.
And I think that's the most heartbreaking part, is you see the way that these parents will like quote these children, and the quotes to me are like, they're so like heartfelt, they're so raw, and it gets immediately dismissed as like a script that they're being told to read by like their anime Discord or something
or
ridiculous.
Their therapist,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The reason that so many transgender kids suffer or die by suicide is because they want and seek love, to be seen as themselves, to be loved as who they really are, but are often turned down by those who should see them the most, the ones that should trust them the most. I can't be sure, but I would not be surprised if this is exactly what led to Andrew Martinez's tragic loss. We are lessened by his death, but it was because the people who could have seen him, who could have cared for him, didn't. All because they were manipulated to care more about a system of power rather than the person in front of them. This objectification and infantilization shows how systems continually view human beings as objects to be thrown around, wielded to further their ends, and remove us from loving the people who need us most, who are most vulnerable to being tossed aside by these systems, to dehumanize them and see their loss as not that big a deal, because their lives were never going to be able to function for the system anyways. How sad. All of this showcases, while the presentation and framing of the film are distinctly different from Matt Walsh's more strongman appeal that I spoke about at the beginning of this video, both films, like Gender Transformations and What is a Woman, ultimately sell the same exact narrative, one leading towards fascism. After What is a Woman came out, gender-critical feminists seemingly balked at the film, shocked that the movie ended with Walsh upholding a patriarchal viewpoint of womanhood, with men being on top and women being in the home. They were also angry that a man like Matt Walsh, who often supports white supremacist beliefs like white replacement theory, or that young white girls need to be mainly viewed for their need to reproduce to counteract the spread of non-white cultures, was the one who shared their same arguments about transgender people. Helen Joyce, who wrote the anti-trans book Trans, Where Ideology Meets Reality, which is itself a 300-page regurgitation of the same narratives found within Gender Transformations, even publicly argued with Walsh.
The gender-critical feminists that I mentioned earlier are critical of trans ideology, but they don't understand how their own movement created it. The feminists are the ones who first argued that men and women are basically the same, aside from meaningless anatomical differences. They are the ones who declared that most sex differences are social constructs. Sound familiar? They don't want to admit any of this, of course, so some gender-critical feminists have tried to flip this around and say that those of us with, quote, traditional views on sex have been the ones to set the stage for trans ideology.
He's a very conservative Catholic. He's somebody who's anti-abortion, he says feminism is the worst thing that's ever happened to Western civilization, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think he understands, in fact, I'm certain he doesn't understand, that makes him part of the whole problem. Because the problem, and it's visible all through the film, is that both conservatives like Matt Walsh and gender ideologues that he's mocking fairly, completely fairly, both believe that gender stereotypes and gender roles are inherent to what it is to be a woman. One side uses them to define what a woman is. Matt Walsh thinks that they're inseparable. He understands that a man is a male person and a woman is a female person, but he thinks a whole load of things follow from that, about who's in charge, who makes the sandwiches, whose voice gets heard, and all of this sort of thing. Well, if you give your average teenage girl the choice between cutting off her breasts, taking testosterone, and having a shot at being seen as the half of humanity that's regarded as truly human, or accepting that she's Matt Walsh's wife in the kitchen making sandwiches and asking him to open the jar, which is very near the end of the film, she'll cut her tits off and take testosterone.
Oh my God.
So he's part of the problem.
Yet, while Helen Joyce pretends that she's a feminist appalled by Matt Walsh, what she fails to recognize is that her rhetoric ultimately upholds a fascistic binary dichotomy based on eugenics ideals, one which places only white, cisgender, straight, non-disabled men and women as the only legitimate humans who need to propagate the world, with men and women constantly fighting each other, with men being at the top of the power dynamic. without recognizing that that is only one axis of how this whole system works. Despite them arguing that they're fighting for women's rights and autonomy, gender-critical folks constantly push for the control of women's bodies and rigidly define what a woman should be, whether they be assigned women at birth, trans men, cis women, non-binary person, or something else. Take, for example, how at a recent conference this image leaked where Joyce and others argued for horrific genital inspections of children to know their sex, supposedly, forgetting, by the way, that genitals don't equal your chromosomes or biological sex, something that I spoke about in this video, as well as arguing for what they called sex-based uniforms on children, forcing boys and girls to wear specific clothes. Gender-critical feminists like Helen Joyce remain so fixated on fighting this endless cycle of men versus women and how trans women are just men that she refuses to see how it ultimately just serves the us versus them narrative that fascism fuels itself upon, instead of reaching out to see the vast diversity of humanity around her that she could be in solidarity with to make a more egalitarian society. And by the way, I don't wish to paint her or any of these anti-trans folks as innocuous or innocent. These folks know the dishonest way they frame things, as we discussed earlier. It is clear from the way they talk about everyone. Everything from trans people to people of color become objects for gender-critical feminists to frame it as tools for themselves. All Helen Joyce, gender-critical feminists, and films like Gender Transformations do is just create a new entry point to the same exact funnel that leads to Matt Walsh's answer. A reinforcement of hegemonic, fascistic culture that attempts to destroy everything unlike itself, using any tool it can as it creates its endless doom spiral towards non-existence.
It's like the difference between saying someone's a fascist and saying someone's a Nazi. Someone can be a Nazi and a fascist, but sometimes people are just a fascist. I don't think every anti-trans person is automatically like a Nazi or an anti-Semite, because again, as you've discussed, there is a pipeline. So I think there are people at different levels of it. There are people who were all the way fucking bought in, like Alex Jones, fuck him. People love to call Jewish people Nazis, and I would like them to not do that. Since it is a movement that was devoted to murdering us. Ben Shapiro is definitely anti-trans. He is Jewish, though. He's also, people have said shit about him, and he said shit that contributes, and it's so complicated that, like, there are Jewish people participating in the anti-trans movement. Chaya Reichik, I am like, girl, she's Orthodox Jewish, and she is, like, actively participating in, like, neo-Nazi shit, and I'm like, girl, they're gonna kill you one day.
Yeah,
you're an idiot. Like, it's messy. Because a lot of people are single issue. My guess would be, because Chaya Reichik is an Orthodox Jew, there are some elements of Orthodoxy that can be pretty gendered. And pretty like, women are supposed to do this and men are supposed to do this, and you sit on separate sides of the synagogue, like there's a men's side and a women's side. And trans people, if you are that type of Orthodox, could fuck up your whole system. There's not a section for non-binary people at the synagogue. We've only got one, I forget the name of the thing that you put. You might have Jewish people who watch it and going to be like, idiot, it's this. There's like a name for the wall that goes between the men's side and the women's side traditionally. And I don't remember the name of it. There's a lot of levels to how a Jewish person could get bought into this stuff, either on the gender stuff or because a lot of right-wingers are like, we're super pro-Israel. They're not, but like they just want a place to stick all the Jews. But there's some Jewish people who, like, their single issue is Israel. And so if some right-wingers are saying anti-trans stuff, but they're also saying we love Israel, that might be what buys them in. It's messy, but a lot of times I think Jewish people get caught up in it because of being kind of a single issue voter, as it were.
This is something that I deeply want everyone to take away from this video. While it is important to recognize that anti-trans views lead to fascism, you have to understand that fascism is not just having Nazis or anti-Semites nearby you. Many, myself included, trying to link gender-critical feminism to fascism will often point to anti-Semites or Nazis coming in to support anti-trans viewpoints to argue that anti-transness is fascism. We saw this exact argument happen when neo-Nazis showed up in New Zealand to support Kelly J. Keane Minshall, an anti-trans campaigner, or how people pointed to Jennifer Bialik sending her supporters to a neo-Nazi in her works, or in how J.K. Rowling supports both Kelly J. Keane Minshall, but also supported YouTuber Magdalene Burns in her anti-trans manifesto, a YouTuber who spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories before she passed away. Yet, while this tactic is an excellent way to clearly showcase how these different bigotries are linked together, many anti-trans bigots like Rowling, Minshall, or Bialik will always try to have plausible deniability by saying, Well, we don't say those anti-Semitic or hateful things. They'll try to say, well, the Nazis are a different group. They don't stand for us and we aren't fascists. You're the fascists for saying that we're the fascists, despite the fascists showing up to support us.
What, how am I going to prevent aggressive men for coming to my event? How on earth would I be able to prevent somebody from coming to a free speech event?
Why do you think they show up?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask Nazis why they show up to women's rights events. I'm pretty sure it's not because they support women's rights.
This is why it's important to recognize that anti-trans hate and rhetoric against trans people is itself fascistic and based in the same ideals of eugenics, control, and fueled out of anxieties based in capitalism, as well as neoliberalist policies that prop it up. Our society today just has a cartoonish view of fascism as just Nazis, when really fascism is a much deeper problematic ideology beyond just wearing a Hitler cosplay. Yet this contradictory messiness is the point. As Jean-Paul Sartre said about anti-Semitism, but something that equally applies well to fascism and anti-trans hate,
never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous and open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. They even like to play with discourse, for by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. If you press them too closely, they will abruptly fall silent, loftily indicating by some phrase that the time for argument is past.
The goal of all of these narratives of bigotries are to make an emotional appeal, not a factual one. My debunking of all of gender transformations as well as these anti-trans rhetorics will probably not convince anyone that is wrapped up in these narratives already. I hope that maybe if you out there sent this video to them that this does help them, and I hope if you are watching this and you do believe a lot of these narratives that maybe some of the things that I pointed out have helped you see that a lot of this is bullshit. But at the end of the day, for many of them, I'm a trans woman. I'm seen as inherently malicious, mischievous, a liar trying to take away your children from you, because that's what they've been emotionally told to believe. It does not matter all the proof that I can show you that I'm just a weird Trekkie dork who has too much time on my hands making YouTube videos, or all the proof around anti-trans disinformation that I can show you. I'm just seen as an inherently malicious, corruptive force trying to hurt small children, especially young girls. And this is why I am often seen as the bad guy when I talk about these things, even by people who say that they are transgender supportive. Because to talk about anti-trans hate means that I have to talk about how it is linked with all of these systems of bigotries and the very basis that our United States and Western culture is built upon. So by advocating for trans people, I need to advocate against white supremacy, against capitalism, against all of these things. So even people who say they are trans supportive will ultimately say that I'm the asshole, that I'm being too aggressive, because I have to, by necessity, argue against the very things that they take as stabilizing their lives and their ability to pay their bills. I can't tell you the number of times in recent months where, even in spaces where they've told me that they support me, I have been expressly framed, even by other trans women, as manipulative, a secret hand behind the scenes either being controlled or controlled by people of color for my own agendas, that I'm an animal abuser trying to hurt others because of stuff I did as a 7-year-old. It's all based on trans misogyny, because it's an emotional appeal against these systems, building on presupposed biases against trans women. I'm not saying that I'm a perfect person or perfect being, no one is, and I've definitely made some fuck-ups. I'm learning along with many of you, and the way to get through that is to take responsibility for those things. But the reason that I and many other trans people are often vilified is because, by advocating for ourselves, we have to inherently advocate for fights against white supremacy and capitalism. And that fuels anxiety, so people would rather uphold those presupposed biases they have about the world and say that it's the trans women being ridiculous, rather than say, yes, we need to destroy this entire system, because it's all built on lies and bullshit that just harms people over and over and over again, even those at the top. Ultimately, to pull it back, the reason that gender-critical pipelines or anti-trans narratives or many other bigotries appeal to specific groups is because those people often don't find themselves in community with diverse groups of people around them. Thus, by recognizing all of these things as separate fights rather than interlocking systems based on supporting neoliberalism, capitalism, Western culture, colonialism, it allows them to continually reinforce it. To talk about a specific one, the fear that there's trans kids coming out more and more and parents should be worried about that plays into the anxieties of the friendly capital L liberal parents who just want to care about queer people and trans people, but are scared about all this new terminology that they've never heard of, or see more trans people around them that they've never really seen before at this point in their life because they weren't around trans people, and makes it just seem like they're coming out of nowhere, and thus can be manipulated into ultimately reinforcing this painful and terrible system. Gender-critical feminists like to pretend that they're helping and care about trans people, but they ultimately don't. None of this narrative cares about anyone but the system itself, the money it makes, and the hate it continually fuels itself upon. It's telling to me that in an interview with the director of Gender Transformations, Tobias Eldridge, he was asked if he saw this film as still caring about trans people despite trans people protesting it. It was just expressing concerns, his interviewer was asking. But it's a question that the director actively avoids answering.
At the same time, you're not saying, hey, you know, trans lifestyle isn't bad or anything. He's probably just need to go on this pills and later in life, I assume, right? Is that what you're basically the documentary is trying to say or show, or?
Yeah, it's showing the realities of people who have been through this, and there's also a lot of people regretting their decision, and for many it's also irreversible. They have, you know, means for life.
This all showcases the real intention. While viewers think that something like this is meant to be a caring documentary, is meant to care about children, is meant to care about trans people, but is just expressing concerns, it is not. This is not about concerns for children. It is not about trying to protect kids. It is about trying to defend one's place in a hierarchy. It is why, no matter where you buy in, it's all going to uphold the same status quo, because it's pretending it's under assault when it's the one doing the assaulting to keep people in line. It is why it creates the most overt bigots like Kelly J. Keane Minshall, who the wonderful YouTuber Sean did a profile on, who overtly call for the death of trans people, or Matt Walsh, who pretends to have plausible deniability as he incites harassment and targeting of transgender people, but also creates people like Helen Joyce, who like to clutch their pearls and say that they aren't contributing to that is too far, when that is just the natural extension of what they generate. All of this is violence. And it is hard to recognize sometimes. We talk about it clinically, digging down into the facts and statements. It makes Excel seem easily done through medical systems or films like this. It becomes cold, even as we speak about how emotions are manipulated. But these narratives have a price, often in human lives. The struggle for trans liberation is not an isolated fight for trans people alone, but one front in a battle against a system that tries to oppress us all. And we are not alone in that fight, but we need to reach for each other to be able to push back together in solidarity. A fight for trans liberation must come coupled with solidarity with Jewish, Black, Brown, Asian, queer, and many other communities. The effect of these narratives is to kill trans people, but that is not its only goal. It's an effort to create a system built off of a death cycle that will continually find the next groups to target and will fall into fascism to fuel its endless thirst for destruction, to create a supposedly utopian world that can never exist because human beings are always going to be different from each other. And that's a beautiful thing. Fascism, and the neoliberalism that justifies it, only seeks to make everyone the same. That recognition is necessary for the second point, how we individualize these problems. You probably clicked on this video because in the title it sold itself as a takedown of a single film. To this day, my biggest videos on this channel are ones that I've done on Matt Walsh or J.K. Rowling because they are single figures, because it's easy for us to point to that and say, hey, those specific people are the problem. And while I'm very proud of the works that I've done and I love the works of other YouTubers like Sean, they often focus on anti-trans hate as the product of singular groups or individuals. And that is an easy narrative to sell, and I emphasize the word sell, because that's what the system wants us to sell it as, an individual problem. And I feel that anxiety too. It's why I sold this video as about gender transformations alone, when it's really about so much more. It also makes the idea of fighting back feel like something achievable on our own. If we take down these specific people, these specific groups, then we can beat this anti-trans hate, but we won't. They are products of a system that will continually create more people like them. It's easy to denounce fascists and bigots like Kelly J. Keane Minshall, Jennifer Bilek, or J.K. Rowling, but as I hope I showed, it's a whole damn narrative that is fascistic to its core. It's not just that they associate with Nazis, what they argue for is inherently leading to the same ends, whether they know it or not, and more of them know it than they want to admit, and a lot of them are more willing to manipulate others into falling into it with them. It's an intentional machine constantly incentivizing the manipulation of fear-based emotions for their own ends. That machine grinds on and on and on, no matter how many Hydra heads you cut off, because it will continually grow back more. And that is a scary monster to fight. It almost feels like it's unbeatable. For me, this video was imposing to write. I had a ton of breakdowns writing this video. It felt like I couldn't tackle it all. Because I can't. There's too much to talk about, too much to say. I felt like I couldn't handle it all because when I started writing one thing, I realized that it interconnected with 20 other things that I needed to explain. And that's the purpose of all of this. It's intentionally made to feel eldritch, Byzantine, overwhelming, and make you feel like you are alone against a torrent sea. But we aren't. We have solidarity between us, but we must recognize that we must become something new, that is our goal in that solidarity and fight, not continually focus on the fight on their terms. Our goal is to fight beyond them, fight through them, not just to fight them. This is something that I'm constantly learning, especially as a white trans woman. The awareness that in order to fight anti-trans bigotry, my work has to come alongside trying to point others towards identities that intersect with this fight as well. To talk about how whiteness as a construct is something that we also need to fight against, while understanding that I myself sit at a place that benefits from it. I can never fully encompass or speak to the entirety of this fight because in many ways, while I am a victim, I am not the primary target. But we are all victims of a system that places us at different levels within its ranks and tells us to fight those next to, above, and below us, fearing them constantly, instead of seeing solidarity between them. Whiteness as a construct is but one way these systems have generated a hierarchy for us to view ourselves as different and or better, and thus needing to be protected at all cost, both through violence and control, and through a eugenic desire to propagate ourselves further, saying that we need to continually create more people like us, when instead we should try to create more people beyond us. Then every person is then placed into a framing that either justifies their control, views them for breeding, or needs to be eliminated as a threat to that hierarchy. And working to recognize that system is the primary obstacle in our ability to fight back against anti-trans hate and bigotry generally.
The moment the left, like that white people and just the left in general, regardless of race, starts unpacking what whiteness is and what it does, like fascists are in trouble. The right specifically is in a lot of trouble, like once we can start doing this. And so for me, this use of trans men to reinforce this story and create this idea, it just, at first, it really just, it felt really invalidating and terrible. But at this point, I almost see it as like the flare up of a dying infection, if that makes sense. Like it's just, they are aggressively trying to push this idea, and they're trying to make us complicit. Mm-hmm. And we could roll over and, be crushed under the weight of transphobia, or we could see the privilege that we have that they are trying to instrumentalize and use that to stop them.
The way to create that something new is through empathy. All of these anxieties that fascism fuels itself upon stem from creating hierarchies and making people fear losing that position in that hierarchy. So our goal should be to work to eliminate ways we view each other as better or worse than. And we do that through understanding that we all are, each of us, different and beautiful. This fight requires us to look around, see those different from us, and take delight and love that which is not ourselves. Fascism thrives on only loving what it sees in the mirror and trying to press that mirror onto the world. Hope and love thrive on seeing humanity reflected at us, not in a mirror, but in all those around us whom we can love, because they are beautifully different. From that realization, hate cannot survive. Hey, so first off, just taking a beat and a breath, I wish to say thank you for watching this entire video. Kind of jumping off of that, I hope you're taking care of yourself, because I know that this video was not an easy one for anyone to watch given everything that I talk about. Kind of jumping off of that for what I'm going to talk about next, I wish to say that this was not exactly an easy video for me to make. As I mentioned just a few moments ago, I had a lot of breakdowns while making this video, both in the writing process, the filming process, and the post-production process, for numerous reasons, not the least of which was the fact that because this was so overwhelming and big, but I wanted to talk about it all in some way, shape, or form, I just felt like I couldn't do it. And I'm sure I fell short in many ways in this video, but I hope that it at least articulated a lot of the things that needed to be said around how anti-trans bigotry is being utilized today to help further fascism, and how that is deeply terrifying for me, not just as a trans person, but as a human being living in the world right now. And so I do wish to reiterate that while it does seem scary and overwhelming, that there is hope and that hope comes from us, each other, listening to each other and trying to work together and trying to build a better world and fight for it. That is still very much possible, though it will not be easy to do so. And finally, jumping off of that, I do wish to say that between making this video, as well as all the other videos that I've had to make recently on truly horrendous fucking topics, I am honestly mentally exhausted. On top of that, I will say that this last year, and I don't necessarily need people to feel sorry for me, I'm just trying to get people to understand, this last year has been really difficult to endure as a creator. As my platform has grown, as well as the fact that I've been speaking about these issues, both as it relates to things like Palestine and Gaza, as well as trans rights and numerous other things, there's just been a lot of shit thrown at me, specifically as a trans woman through a misogynistic lens, as well as conflating and combining with all the other disinformation around a lot of the topics that have been that we've been discussing in this video. Honestly, it has been deeply disheartening. I won't go into details, and I will probably talk about it at some point, but like there have been times where I've been targeted and I literally was like breaking down in front of friends who I hadn't even seen in months, but just couldn't be with at that moment emotionally because of all the shit happening online. And what sucks even more is that all of this has been happening at what should be one of the most joyous moments in my life. And I'm not using this to self-promote. Again, this is just an explanation. I am making a movie called Identities, which is a science fiction film that's going to be coming out on Nebula later on this year, and I am so pumped for it. We're going to have a trailer out soon, and just I'm so pumped, and I'm so proud and excited of what it is and everyone who worked on it, and I've worked very hard to try to make it both in front of and behind the camera, a very diverse and inclusive production that centers around a queer and trans theme, but certainly is something that I hope moves well beyond that for people to relate to and hopefully see themselves within, again, both in the story, in front of the camera, and behind it as well. But making that has been really difficult, as it was always going to be no matter what the context or time I was making it in, but the fact that I am making it at this specific time when I feel so called to make videos like this, or I have to deal with all the other bullshit that comes with it, as well as just being a trans woman in the world today, I am fucking exhausted. Like truly, over the past few days and weeks have been very near just like not being able to get out of bed, exhausted. And that sucks because I have so many things that I still want to make and do, both here on YouTube and hopefully in other spaces if Identities takes off and does well and proves that I can make stuff like that to you and to other people. Like there's so many things that I really have been working on and excited to make, but I just don't have the energy at the moment. And as a result, I am going to be taking a little bit of a break after this video comes out to, number one, finish off Identities, because we're still in that, as well as take a little bit of a rest for myself. I don't know how long it'll be. I doubt it will be much longer than a few weeks to months, so you may not even notice a difference in the amount of videos that I upload on this channel, because I have been slowing down a little bit just for my own health and also because of everything I've been doing on this channel. But I do wish to just let you know that that is going to be happening. And honestly, it's kind of scary because, again, due to all the stuff that has been going on, you know, as well as, again, the world that we live in right now, finances have not been the best. But I just know I need to do it for my health. So all that being said, this is just to say, number one, thank you to all my patrons who do support me. I could not be able to take a break without you because you're really the only way that I know I have a actual steady income, because while places like Nebula and YouTube and stuff like that are great and I do get some income from them, they aren't exactly my main source of income. That is my patrons. So just thank you to all of you for that. And I do just, you know, if videos like this are meaningful to you, if hopefully Identities is meaningful to you, I do just ask if you would consider supporting me over on Patreon. It would mean a lot. Again, it does help pay my bills and help feed my cat, Kipo, who is floating around here somewhere. So yeah, that does mean a lot. Again, The only way I'm able to do videos like this to take care of my health and to hopefully make even bigger and better both videos and movies outside of YouTube is through Patreon, as well as, you know, support like those of Nebulas and elsewhere. So if you can, please consider it. It would really mean a lot to me. But again, totally cool. I understand times are tight now for so many people. It's actually been a reason that I've lost a few patrons because, again, I understand people need to take care of themselves. But if you are able to and do like my videos, please consider it. It would mean a lot to me. But even if you're not able to or don't want to, I will say just again, thank you for watching this video. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. Please take care of yourselves and remain in the fight, but make sure to take rests as you need. Beyond all of that, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, all the YouTube algorithm-y type stuff. And with that said, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper. I thanked my patrons last night. Pre-flight, 0 hour, 9 a.m. And they make me as high as a kite by then. I thank them so much. I thank them as a wife. Love you. Thank you for supporting me. I adore you all. Here's your wonderful names. Joe Herman Hold, Carrie Ellen Foss, Niels Osborne Odenholm, Arklesair, Barbie Ann Rounds, Sarah Montgomery, Jack McCallan, Stephen Kleinard, Hannah Friedrich, Christian Hurst, Jazz Miss, Randy Thompson, Samuel Howard, Quite Bearish, Marshall Nye, Rose Conley, Eltan Tivy, Courtney Ray Kelly, Dark Archon, Auntie Kate 808, Tara Rose, Lily Blaney, Vincent Ellington, Amada Kaiba, Miranda Keitel, Zane Schussler, Michael Woolnitz, Matt Chung, Alex Miller, Nyasa Mayer, Super Desi, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Todd Verling, Meadow Whisperer, Joseph Dewey, Semi Joe Retro, Jem Shin, Iron, Chris Showers, Lily Gray, Angela Hendricks, Joelle Guillory, Luna, James Krivda, Shep Alderson, Dominic Noble, Weirdy Beardy, Kaylee Lang, Sonia Nero Perdo, Nathan Fraughton, Farangato, Quattro, Ryan Hunter, Freelith George Holstrom, W. Randy Edie, Sean Sullivan, Kevin Freitag, Sergeant Bradshaw, Epsilon is greater than, Fly and Kata, Bob Saget, Verdux Kai, Troy Stull, Blue, Craig and David, Teague Wilson, Scott Russell, Stephen Richardson, John Weatherby, Brits Krieg, Carry On, Casual Observer, Kay Liss, Patricia Kromtick, Jess Johnson, Kurt Mullen, Prince of Void, Sarah Lemerow, Jason Knott, Teresa Bailey, Joanne the Wretch Witch, Hope, Jason Tuliana, Ruben Gines, Shield Maiden 4444, Elizabeth Kirstensen, The Mighty Jinjo Joe, Beatrix Purvis, Matthew Craiglow, Roy Negby, Grumpy Dragon 75, Emma Ramirez, Melody Ann Winters Good, Sasha M, Damian Rice, Valerie Blackbird, Melinda Walters, Kylara Auroral, Sean Piper, Mark H. Williams, author, Jade Persuades, Mark H. Williams, author, Adam Smatcher, Jades Persuades, David Dema, Tyler Edwards, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, Blueberry Hill, Sarah Bystam, Teresa, Doherty Lucero, Laura Demero, Penile Sparing Vaginoplasty, Celestial Dawn, DM Collins, Tori Perez, Caroline Clark, Crit Max, Lev Goodwin, Knife Fan, Callum McLeod of Clan McLeod, Michael Weber, Lou Toussaint, Henry Pierce, Tom G311, Julie Werner, and Chai Cat Midnight Sky. Mwah. Love you all, adore you all. Sorry I couldn't do it all as William Shatner, but timing and everything, but adore you and thank you patrons for making all of this possible. I love you so much.